Hello and welcome everyone to today's event, Enterprise Cloud Wars Summit. This event is being sponsored by Cloud Health by VMware, Zerto, and NetApp. I'm Tracy Cook with Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. In this half-day summit, we'll give you unvarnished insights on the pros and cons of all the top cloud platforms. We'll discuss frameworks for evaluating your choices on everything from momentum to performance to technical considerations to critical questions of cost to deep insights about the cultural fit of certain cloud platforms and much more. The summit includes 3 sessions featuring our editors and hand-picked industry experts. Each session includes a presentation followed by a Q&A session. You can see the full agenda in the slide area of your console as well as in the resource tab on your console. Before we begin, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. The event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. We'll send you an email when the recording is available, and that should be on Monday, July 20th. As I mentioned earlier, we'll host a Q&A session after each presentation. Please be sure to take this opportunity to get your questions answered by our experts. And finally, our sponsors have provided a lot of useful resources for you to review and download. You can access them from the resource tab on your console, so please go ahead and take a look. And now I'd like to welcome Scott Becker, Editorial Director of Virtualization and Cloud Review. He's hosting the first session of the day entitled Tech Showdown, Azure, AWS, or GCP. Which cloud platform works best for your enterprise services? So that should be a very interesting session. And now I'd like to pass the webcast over to Scott. Scott, please take it away.
Excellent. Thanks for setting us up, Tracy. So when we started putting together this editorial summit, the first person I thought of for presenting this first session on the technology differences between the main cloud platforms was Michael Frazier, and I'm delighted that he could join us today. So Michael will go through his background when I turn things over to him in a minute, but I'll say that I've known him for probably 7 or 8 years. We met while co-presenting at a cloud conference, and I later asked him to write a major feature for the publication I was running at the time about whether 2014 would be the year that desktop as a service would finally arrive. So spoiler alert, it sort of didn't, but Mike provided great insights and context about the state of the industry and the state of the tech. So Michael's a serial entrepreneur and consultant, and a through line on his work, at least as long as I've known him, has had to do with helping customers automate their way into the cloud. He's always had his head up and oriented to the strategic differences of the different major cloud providers, while at the same time being into the nitty-gritty of how each major provider provides their services. So that's just going to make him a great guide for our session today. And with that, Michael, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate that intro. And yeah, it was great to write that feature article on DAS in 2014. And interestingly enough, one of the sponsors, NetApp, that acquired CloudJumper this year, has claimed that 2020 is. So I feel like every year becomes, but with the current pandemic, it does seem like 2020 has catalyst VDI, especially into the public cloud. So it's been pretty interesting to see which services are kind of getting pushed into the public cloud. So yeah, it's which ones are getting the most adoption, I should say. So it's pretty interesting. So I'm Mike Frazier. I've ex-Air Force. I used to work on aircraft armament systems on F-15s, which was pretty interesting when I started out my career, and also as a cybersecurity engineer when I first started out, before there was a thing called public cloud. And I don't know, about 10, 12 years ago, I got into the public cloud and was doing stuff with the multiple companies, was doing hyper-converged infrastructure before that was even a term, private cloud for the SMB market, then got into public cloud, did a lot of consulting around that. And currently I have a startup called Refactor. I'm the co-founder and CEO, and we do a lot of stuff in public cloud and hybrid cloud and around DevSecOps automation, which is pretty cool. And then I also last year got my master's in computer science using my GI Bill, which was awesome, a great perk for being a veteran from the military. And I speak at other events as well, a lot around DevOps and DevSecOps and cloud and other industry events around Red Hat and BrightTalk as well. So you'll see me out there. And recently had a book come out by All Day DevOps Feedback Loops, and I'm actually one of the featured authors / speakers in there. So you can check that out as well. So today we're going to go through and compare Azure, AWS, and GCP, which ones, different types of focus on, looking at not just what services are the best and also kind of supporting the tools, but holistically looking at, what services, what cloud provider works best for you, who has the deepest, not just ecosystem of third-party vendors that they work with, but also on the partner side too, which is really important as enterprises are getting into public cloud or they're looking at diversifying and they want to go multi-cloud, figuring out what makes sense for them, even from a partner perspective, and then also third-party support of products as well. And another hot topic right now is around open source and who's using or who has the most, not just, again, open source services available, but also being friendly to open source and pushing out different types of products and services around open source, which is pretty critical in 2020 and around any solutions that you're trying to create in the public cloud or lifting and shifting into the public cloud as well. So the first thing I like to go through is the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So every year they release a Magic Quadrant, and as you can see, the leaders here are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google. There's some other players in the field, Alibaba, Oracle, and IBM. And it's interesting because the majority, the top three, have more market share than every other cloud provider combined. And so the key is kind of that there's a couple of things here. One is, Microsoft is catching up quickly, and we'll go into why that is. And then Google as well has had a phenomenal growth the last year or two, and that has to do with pushing various services that are out there. It's also interesting because all of the three major cloud providers like to bury or even hide their overall numbers as well from revenue. And so being able to kind of figure out, what is actually on the public cloud side versus what is actually revenue generation and utilization on the more software as a service side of the, O365, now known as M365, and Google on G Suite. And so, understanding that, where they sit. So it's not just about revenue, but it's also about, the footprint that they have and a bunch of other factors go into it and metrics to figure out who's still the leader. So Amazon overall is still the leader in the space from a standpoint of just the length that they've been around since 2006, the amount of customers that they have on board, but the other two are catching up quickly. And it's interesting to see the Magic Quadrant that comes out every year. It's also interesting to see who has dropped out. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but, there used to be HP used to have a cloud too. I've been around long enough that I've seen, clouds come and go as well, which has been super interesting. So it's very, very interesting to see the top three cloud providers kind of stay there, and then the other ones be kind of more of niche players that are providing, cloud services around their products like Oracle or IBM that used to be SoftLayer, and now it's the IBM cloud. Now that they have, they still have, other customers that want to be able to roll out IBM services on there as well. So it's interesting to see where each of these players sit inside of the Magic Quadrant, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out this year as well when that gets released. So from a market share perspective, AWS is far ahead still from an overall market share at 32.4%. Microsoft is catching up fairly quickly though, and they're at about 17.6%. Again, this is from last year, so it'll be interesting to see how these numbers compare in 2020 when those numbers come out. Specifically around, eventually if Microsoft breaks out the overall Azure numbers, just generally speaking on the revenue side as well. And then Google Cloud is at about 6%. And then every other cloud out there, and that includes not just the ones you saw in there, but other ones like DigitalOcean and various other, providers out there as well. So they still make up a large portion of the public cloud market as well. But the top three are continuing to gain market share, and they keep eating away at the other cloud providers' market share. So I wouldn't be surprised, 3, 4, 5 years down the road if the top three, have another 20% or more of the overall market share. There's always going to be a place for the niche players that are going to have a particular type of offering that makes sense for a very small subset of customers, but overall the top three cloud providers are diversifying more and more in what they provide overall in the services that they have out there, and then the ecosystem of partners as well that support them. And every single cloud, all these top three cloud providers have pretty strong even certification process. Every certification out there is showing to be more money that can be made by a cloud practitioner out there. And then there's a lot of different kind of paths as well for existing technical talent to upskill. So as that's happening as well, and more people can support, there'll be more and more enterprises out there, consuming more just public cloud services in general. So we're going to start with AWS first. So over a million customers, 14 years. 2006 was the year. March of 2006 was the year that they came out. It was interesting when that happened. It was pretty foreign for most people. The public cloud originally was created by AWS to be able to provide additional services out there that they had, additional computing power that they could sell that they themselves weren't using internally. And so it was pretty interesting to see how they kind of were the pioneer here in carving out, but how the market has changed in the last 14 years as well. And overall, the footprint of AWS is, worldwide. They have a lot of regions coming. We'll get into that when I compare each one on some of the stats between each of the cloud providers. But every single one of these cloud providers has a fairly good global footprint with a lot of different options to be able to pick and choose, different regions and availability zones and so on. And then the other piece of this is, the ability to serve from a compliance standpoint and have the coverage as well there. So that's also been another issue for a lot of enterprises to want to move from, on-premise or your own data centers to the public cloud, is to make sure that not only that there is compliance and compliance capabilities in place, but also making sure that there is everything that would be needed to be able to utilize the public cloud just like you would on premise. And I still see a lot of reason around having hybrid cloud as well, and it all just depends upon what your overall needs are and how you're going to move into each cloud, what the cloud provider is going to provide to you. The second one is Azure. So they have upticked their overall compliance offerings significantly. The other piece from the enterprise side is Fortune 500 companies are using Azure. There's a large push on Azure because it's easy to kind of push that if you're already using M365, or as it was known, O365 up until recently. And the partner base as well is critical too. Who's going to support the move to the public cloud? A lot of enterprises utilize outside firms to help them. And so Azure's been a big push on the enterprise side. And they've also contributed very heavily on the security side, over $1 billion in annual security investment, to make sure that they're continuing to add and supply what enterprises need in order to feel safe with moving to the public cloud. That being said, there has been a lot of issues with outages over the last few years on Azure too. So Microsoft has been pretty good about focusing time and attention on trying to make sure to solve for that, and also expanding their overall footprint as well to make more and more locations available, to make sure that they're as close geographically to customers as possible. And then also to think about the data sovereignty issues across the world and where that is. I work with customers all over the world, and certain countries or certain locations, if there's not a data center in country, it's still a concern for them. And so there are all kinds of countries out there that still really don't have, other than the core productivity suite like O365 or M365, are not using much of the public cloud, any of them. And so even if you notice here, there's some projected or announced locations even in New Zealand and other places around the world that are helping to expand the capabilities of being able to leverage Azure services even in country, which is great. And there's some options too, if you don't have a data center in country, that you can leverage Azure as well. And we'll get into that in a bit. And then the third one is Google Cloud. So Google has been pretty active the last few years. With the 2012 Google Compute Engine came out, that was what is the IaaS. Google Compute now is the IaaS, or the public cloud side of Google Cloud. And so a lot of companies, especially on the networking side, 8 out of 10 telcos are using Google Cloud. A lot of organizations use Google Cloud for very specific things too. So I see Google Cloud in a lot of multi-cloud strategies, especially around containers and Kubernetes. There's been a massive uptick in Google Cloud trained developers in the last year, over 750,000 new Google Cloud trained developers out there. And it's interesting statistically that if you get a Google Cloud certification, that it is actually known to increase your overall compensation out there as one of the top certifications to get on the public cloud side. And even though they're still far behind Microsoft and AWS, Google is making some serious strides to increase their overall customer base and overall revenue. So year over year in 2019, they increased 53% in revenue, which is a phenomenal number and statistic, even though they're lagging behind the other two cloud providers. And Google provides a lot of awesome services around Kubernetes, containers, ML, AI. And so they have definitely a play in certain areas that are making them at the top of the list when it comes to looking at using some of their overall services. So how do the clouds all stack up together? So as I said earlier, AWS was the first to launch March of 2006. Azure launched in February 2010. Google Cloud, the umbrella of Google Cloud, launched in April of 2008. But as I said, in 2012, that's actually when the IaaS product side launched as Google Compute Engine. And so Google was the third to come to market, and especially on the IaaS side, the public cloud side of the house. From a geographical region standpoint, there are, Azure has the most out there, but when it comes to availability zones, Microsoft considers their data centers availability zones. So it's interesting to see how the different numbers stack up, but every single one of them is pushing really hard on having as many locations around or regions around the globe, with a lot planned as well to ensure that they can get data centers as close to, depending on where you're at in the world, to your country, or even close enough to your states. There's been a bunch of data centers that have launched even here in the U.S. and Canada and so on. So it's interesting to see the footprint and how it's expanding out there. From a compliance standpoint, a lot of push on just general compliance. Google recently announced that they got some FedRAMP authorizations as well recently, which is interesting. I do work on the DoD side too, so it's interesting to see the cloud providers and how much effort that they're putting out on that side of it as well, to make sure that they can also start getting workloads on the DoD and the IC or the Intel community side as well, just government in general. And then overall, from a country standpoint, and again, this goes to kind of data sovereignty and what is available out there and what countries are actually adopting overall services. And so it's critical to understand that in some countries out there, it requires kind of a hybrid approach, or even an approach to look at, is there a way to just get the particular cloud provider in country in your own data centers? And so all of the cloud providers are pushing pretty heavily into providing offerings around that, realizing that you're not going to probably get all the services of any particular enterprise into one particular cloud provider, and also the fact that hybrid cloud will persist for a long time, and so there has to be options for that. And then the nuances around things like data sovereignty are critical as well. And then the last thing I'll kind of talk to here is the annual revenue run rate. So it's interesting overall to see these numbers, and they're all kind of estimated numbers on stats that are out there, but the key is kind of Azure. So there's not really a breakout still of Azure sales when it comes to what their overall numbers are. So they encompass all their numbers as just under cloud. And so so understanding kind of where Azure sits still is kind of a big question mark overall versus AWS. But the overall increase is kind of what I look at overall, and then also the amount of services that keep getting pushed out by each of the cloud providers, and the different, and really how they're listening to enterprise customers and what they're going to be able to continue to provide to them, and making sure that they're also providing the most resilient and hyperscale type platforms on the planet, especially when it comes to all the cloud providers have had issues with outages. And that's something that you really have to think about too when it comes to moving workloads into the public cloud. In some ways, the public clouds are more resilient than what you may have built out in your own data centers. But in some other ways, there are different types of, architecture. All of your hardware is, abstracted away from you. And then the other piece of this is having to retrain your existing talent, or having to bring on net new talent. So some of the top jobs out there, cloud architects, cloud security architects, DevOps engineers, cloud is a piece of their overall of the domains that they have to cover. And the existing technical talent internally, more on the ops side and the security side, and having to understand how to use these clouds in what they're going to be, how you're going to be able to support them from a technical team standpoint is also critical. So again, I mentioned earlier around the certifications, which are critical, and it's just, to note that, you're going to have to add on additional skills no matter what. So I usually recommend to organizations to pick one cloud if you have no clouds internally that you've adopted yet, and then figure out, what makes sense for you from a services standpoint, and kind of look at all of the different stats and everything that you're going through to make your decisions that's going to make sense for the organization, and what kind of skills that your existing talent is going to have to bring on, or you're going to create a net new cloud team, whatever that may be. So overall, from a services standpoint, AWS has 212, Azure has 265, but some of them are ancillary services. So from an overall standpoint, AWS and Azure are pretty neck and neck when it comes to services offered. And then Google has the least amount of services out there, but they have other offerings that are unique to them as well, which is pretty interesting, things like Anthos. And so, again, kind of looking at the services that are offered, a lot of them offer the same type of services, especially on the IaaS and the more traditional IaaS side. And then when you start digging into cloud native offerings and looking at how they compare or the different types of products, and then you really have to gauge on each cloud provider which one makes the most sense to be able to pick for what you want to be able to use if you have third-party products that you're just bringing into the public cloud, or you're deciding to actually move to more cloud-native offerings as well. And so you really have to look at and pick and choose which offerings make the most sense for your organization. And also, if you're a Microsoft shop and you're on, say, Active Directory, and you move to M365 and you're using Azure AD, but your dev team, your DevOps team is, all in on AWS, you really have to think about how you can get different teams working together to be able to look at the different services that they may want to be able to use and really hone in on, if you want to have a overall multi-cloud strategy. So I would think about that and really focus in and hone in on what makes the most sense there. And also, again, each of the cloud providers have similar services that map across each one of them. And then there are particular services that they do best as well. And so you have to think about that. And everyone, as soon as one does it, so a good example of that is Google Cloud came out with GKE, Google Kubernetes Engine. And then AWS and Azure came out with, AWS has EKS, which is their managed Kubernetes version, and then Azure came out with AKS. And so every time one cloud provider provides a service out there as one of the first, then the other cloud providers provide them out there. But it also is, it depends on, what you want to use, how it makes sense for your organization, and then how many clouds that you want to have your technical teams have to support as well. But multi-cloud is definitely something I would always have every enterprise entertain looking at and making sure you're picking and choosing the best services that make the most sense for your organization. So overall, how does the networking compare? So it's interesting too, because each of them have their strengths. So AWS has 216 point of present locations, so edge and regional caches. So if you're trying to use you want to use the CDN service, or AWS also has 97 direct connect locations. So it's interesting because of the fact that one of the issues on AWS that I've seen with enterprises that I work with is the limited geographical locations, the regions available. So if you were, say, in the middle of the United States, it's been interesting because you have to pick, west or east. And so with stuff like Direct Connect or Express Routes with Azure and so on, you have the ability to directly connect through an ISP. And so it's interesting to see how you can be able to, which ones have strengths in each one of them. And then the ability to also look at, depending on what you're building out as well, what makes sense for you from a CDN, content delivery network type of approach as well, just to make sure that you can have your content as close to your end customer as possible. And then also the same thing, being able to connect your users to the cloud services, because latency is definitely always an issue. So the further you are geographically from the region, depending upon the services that you're trying to provide to your end users, can be an issue as well. And so you really want to think about that too. And so all three of these cloud providers are definitely putting a lot of investment into making sure they can provide as good of an experience and as many options as possible for you to have the best experience from a network perspective, because networking is by far one of the major issues that when it comes to moving your workloads into the public cloud. And then I've also seen issues with really large enterprises moving their workloads. I was working with one on Azure, and the limiting factors of network connection bandwidth bandwidth limitations causes issues. This example was, Azure at the time had a 10 gig limitation, and so they had a 40 gigabit backbone. And so trying to be able to figure out how to distribute out the workloads and make sure that they could still be able to work within the constraints of the limitations on Azure was super interesting. And every single one of them is, as they're taking in feedback from these enterprise customers, they're also working to improve. And I've seen it with all three of them, which is awesome, because that's a critical thing, no matter what, whether it comes to networking or services or anything else. And so as long as all of these three players are constantly looking to improve, from a networking perspective, they're all pretty good when it comes to what you're going to get from them from a networking perspective and how you're going to be able to connect into the services. So from a cloud standpoint, from enterprise and hybrid cloud, especially if you factor in a few things. So on the hybrid cloud side, Azure came out with Azure Stack and worked with some companies that are enterprises that have Azure Stack, VMware, and then the Microsoft Partner Network. So depending upon what you're trying to do from a hybrid standpoint, I view Azure as being, especially on the enterprise side and services side and hybrid. So if you have workloads on premise and you want to be able to leverage them on premise as well in a way that you can extend what you're doing in the cloud. And then from a standpoint of VMware, all three clouds, there was a recent announcement even on Google Cloud Platform as well. So all three of the cloud platforms now support VMware in their clouds. But the critical piece to all this is the partners base. And so overall, Microsoft has the most partners out there. So they were able to, when they launched, leverage their the Microsoft partner base, which is, if you're a Microsoft partner member, you probably have certified engineers on your bench. You may, you're all in on Microsoft technologies. You focus heavily on that. And so from a standpoint of an enterprise and the support to be able to get that around existing workloads, especially if you're lifting and shifting or you're just trying to extend what you currently have on premise, you really have to look at the ecosystem and the partner base as well, and what is going to work best for your enterprise. But if you're a primarily Windows-based shop, or you're all in on a bunch of different Microsoft products, you really want to look at what that looks like for your organization. And I deem Azure to be the best cloud when it comes to that. Now, that being said, depending upon what you're doing, so if you're doing more traditional workloads or you're trying to just extend what you're doing in O365, I would say that you really want to look at the others as well. But if you're doing more on the, if the Kubernetes side, or you're trying to figure out what you're trying to do more cloud native, then obviously some of the other clouds could be a better option for you. But overall, holistically, Azure is the best option if you're trying to extend from a hybrid cloud standpoint the actual cloud itself. So Azure, leveraging Azure Stack, the ability to support VMware. A lot of enterprises have VMware as well. And then the third piece of it is the Microsoft Partner Network and being able to leverage that so you can have the existing talent that you're already maybe you have outsourced companies you're working with, being able to leverage them as well in that capacity. So from a Kubernetes standpoint, I look at Google Cloud. Again, as mentioned earlier, all the clouds have a bunch of different Kubernetes options. Last year at Google Next, Google announced Anthos. Anthos is awesome. It's Google considers it a hybrid cloud as well, but it's really hybrid cloud for Kubernetes. It is an alternative to other products like OpenShift, Red Hat OpenShift. It gives you the ability to natively leverage Kubernetes and orchestrate it out on multiple cloud platforms as well as on-premise as well. Google also has GKE, which is the best managed Kubernetes offering out there, in my opinion. But the others, EKS and AKS from AWS and Azure, are also great. And then Google, Kubernetes was a project that came out from internal work at Google and then got pushed out there in open source in 2014. You hear Kubernetes a lot out there. A lot of organizations are pushing it. Even the DevSecOps initiative at the Air Force is doing right now as well. If you see that out there as well, there's just a ton of Kubernetes in general, and there's a ton of distributions out there around that as well. But from a cloud perspective, I would deem Google Cloud as the best overall for Kubernetes if you're looking at a cloud option for Kubernetes. The next piece is the ability to utilize native CI/CD pipelines. So each one has a different approach to what they're doing there. Every cloud provider provides a Git capability, so the ability to have version control inside of each of the cloud providers. So Azure DevOps has it, Google, and AWS. Each of the competing products out there are Azure DevOps, Google Cloud Build, and AWS Code Pipeline. If you're all in on one of the cloud providers, I would just say use whatever cloud provider you're on, use their CI/CD pipelines. And then there's options as well for multi-cloud. So if you end up doing multi-cloud, there's better options out there to be able to provide for the different cloud providers you want to use as well. If you want to also decouple the options from the cloud provider, but the cloud natives are all great tools as well, and each one of them works really well if you're using each of the cloud providers. So my recommendation here is if you're on one of these clouds, if you want to use native built-in CI/CD, just use the one that the cloud provider has. The cloud provider tools out there, so we have AWS has CloudFormation templates and the CLI. Azure has ARM templates and Azure CLI. Google Cloud has Google Deployment Manager templates and G-Cloud CLI. Overall, I would say that I prefer ARM templates and how they're structured. Google's second, and then CloudFormation is my third option. Overall, though, the other issue is that since AWS came out first, the other two clouds were able to look at and improve upon what they have. So I would say that was an advantage to being second and third to market. And then all the CLIs are pretty strong, and they're all very, very robust in what they can do, and you can do a lot of stuff within the CLI. So I would look at both of the tools and leverage the tools that make sense for you for each of the cloud providers. And from a multi-cloud strategy, I would really look at the different open source tools like Terraform that supports all three of these cloud providers, and then other cloud management platforms out there. Really hone in and figure out if there's one that works for you if you're going multi-cloud. Same thing on CI/CD automation platforms. Look for ones that support multi-cloud so that you have the ability to leverage something outside of the cloud providers. And then the container orchestration platforms, again, whether you're using something like Anthos or OpenShift or Rancher or any of them, look at which ones make the most sense for your organization, but also think about it from a multi-cloud standpoint and what could work for you there. And also hybrid cloud is always kind of the other piece to that as well. And the third one is cloud security platform. So make sure any cloud security platform that you pick will be able to give you options if you decide to utilize other cloud providers too in the future, even if you're only using one now. Overall performance, I kind of equate, it depends on what you're doing. So this is very much subjective to where your end users are, where your workloads are, and so on. But overall, what I've seen notoriously is that Azure actually takes the longest to spin up a lot of the different services to get them up and running. AWS is in the middle of the pack, and Google is at the top of the pack when it comes to the ability to spin up quickly. The network, they're all pretty good on the networking side. And again, it all just comes down to your geographical location and where you're located. And then from a security standpoint, we really have to look at what is available out there. So all three of the cloud providers now have a centralized security dashboard. There are many different security services. So AWS has AWS Security Hub, Azure has Azure Security Center, Google Cloud is Security Command Center. Really often have a centralized dashboard. Then the key is what are the cloud native services that they're providing for you? And then are you also leveraging a third-party cloud security platform as well? So you want to think about that as, are you going to build this into the one cloud that you're using, or are you going to try to leverage an additional platform in conjunction with the public cloud provider? And so think about that. And then also think about what kind of reference architecture they have. So like AWS has the well-architected framework. They all have their best practice reference architecture frameworks around not just security, but also generally how you should build and provision different types of reference architecture. And so look at each one of them. They're all striving pretty hard to provide the best there. So again, that's my recommendation here is to just pick which one makes sense for you on the cloud provider, the main cloud provider that you're currently using. And then on the open source side, we have, they're all pretty open source friendly. You probably heard grumblings out there. You may have seen write-ups. I think there was a New York Times write-up on AWS encroaching on taking open source technology, open source vendor technology and building a product around that. But, overall, all of them are very friendly to open source. Even the one that I would say that I didn't expect at the very beginning, which was Microsoft, has become very, very open source friendly. And actually, there's more Linux machines deployed than Windows machines, as far as I know, the last that I looked at on Azure. So, they're really striving hard to be able to provide as many different options around the open source community as possible, and also being able to support as many of the different open source tools that are available too. So whether it's an end product or a tool, every single one of them is open source friendly. So just look at each one of them, what tools that you can utilize, what services that you're trying to use on them, and see what makes the most sense for you. And that's going to be critical to what you decide to pick. And then the last thing I'll go over is just kind of touching on AI, ML, abilities of all the cloud providers. So each one is striving to provide support around different open source projects like TensorFlow, providing enterprise offerings around that. So Google has built an enterprise, TensorFlow enterprise offering around there. AWS and Azure also have that. The other thing you want to think about is how you're going to scale out as well if you're doing any sort of AI, ML, and what that looks like from a container standpoint. And then also if they're going to be leveraging, say, GPU instances as well. And so you really want to look at what makes sense there. But I would say here, again, they all are investing very heavily into this space. And so they all have viable options depending on which cloud you're using. The only thing that I would say that I like best out of all the cloud when it comes to AI ML is that AWS has the Deep Racer, and so they have a cool AI based it's not remote controlled because it's actually all controlled via their via AI, and so they actually have a pretty cool Deep Racer competition as well, which is pretty cool. So if you didn't know about that, check that out. And awesome. So we have about 10 minutes to answer questions now, and I'll turn it back over to you, Scott, to moderate.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Michael. And great information here. So we've got some questions that have come in already, and go ahead and type them into the console if you have questions. We had a question from Diana just asking about, I guess just a definition. What do you mean by cloud security platform? You covered a couple of slides back.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a bunch of different cloud security platforms out there. You may have heard, originally it was RedLock or Evidence.io or Lacework or, different companies that have created platforms around cloud security. And then, Evidence.io and RedLock got bought by Palo Alto Networks. But it's really a platform that's you're able to build out any sort of security guardrails around the different types of services that you have, and then being able to have an overlay on top of them from a security standpoint. The systems themselves are fairly reactive in nature, so they're going to expect that you already have stuff built out, and then you would utilize them to go look at what you may have, and then if you have anything that needs to be remediated, some of them will even help with that as well. So when I say cloud security platform, it's a third-party outside platforms that have the support for multiple clouds and coverage on the different products or different services that each of the cloud provider has. And some support more products, others support less. You'll also see other products out there coming out that are supporting like specifically around Kubernetes, things like that. So you really have to look at that too and what they support. But they all are those type of platforms are also striving to support the security around something like Kubernetes on different, all three of the major cloud providers too.
Okay, cool. Let's move. You just mentioned Kubernetes. Let's go to a question from Bruce, who's asking, does Google offer a canned Kubernetes instance? I believe for AWS, they're built from scratch. Is that something that you can address?
Yeah. So there's a managed Kubernetes that is offered by Google. So that's the Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE, that's available out there. Then if you want to manage your own setup as well, you can obviously deploy and manage your own Kubernetes instances as well. But from a managed standpoint, Google's is GKE, AWS is and if you mean like built from instances or, being able to spin up from, scratch, there's always going to be some configuration that you're going to have to do, but all the managed services make it considerably easier. And then there's some of the underlying access is abstracted away from you as well. So you just have to look at what makes the most sense for you. I even have enterprise work with that are, did they deploy their own Kubernetes clusters themselves and they don't want to use the managed because they want full control over that as well. So it just depends on what makes sense for you. But yeah, the Google, if I'm reading this question correctly, is GKE.
Okay, super. And I just want to answer the question quickly from Subbu, who's asked us to talk a little bit about cost factor across cloud providers. So stay tuned in the next hour. It's going to be entirely about cost factors. So we won't address that now, but you'll hear a lot about that in the next hour. Let's see. There was a question here from Linda. She was asking about the performance category. She wanted us to repeat which was best, middle, and west in that performance category.
Okay, well, yeah, this, and again, this is my opinion, and this is what I've seen, building solutions, myself for many, many years. But overall, just solely on like provisioning performance, Google's at the very top, and then AWS, and then Azure. But there are a bunch of other things around that aside from just provisioning that go into, figuring out and quantifying what are some of the best as well. So you really have to look from a performance standpoint where, the different geographical locations of the different regions are available for the services that you want to be able to, utilize. And then also the networking as well and the direct connects. And if you're going to use on the CDN side, where all those point of presence are. So you just have to factor in a bunch of different things. But then there's areas that I would focus in on, like, provisioning speeds, which is, like I said, Google, AWS, and Azure. So that, so there's different factors on different pieces and parts of that. So I wouldn't say, any one cloud comes out at the top overall on everything. But in subsections, there's definitely clear winners there.
Right, and that's a great point. You've got really deep experience in provisioning, just like from what I know of your history.
Yep.
So that's a great caveat there. We had a question from Dennis, which is, so Google best for Kubernetes, Azure for best for hybrid. Which would be the best reason to choose AWS? Would that be stability? What's your take?
Yeah, I would say maturity, the amount of customers they have overall, so they really know what their customers want and continue to crank out services on a pretty good cadence as well. And then the other one is around compliance. So they were the first to have all kinds of different compliances or capabilities around different compliance requirements, and also their availability of the different security services as well. So I would factor in, maturity as being the top of that. And then the other piece of that is the ecosystem. So AWS has a pretty good ecosystem on the partner side. I don't equate it still to the same thing as the Microsoft partner network, because that's more on the, supporting Microsoft products. So again, Azure has a leg up there, but overall, AWS has a really good ecosystem as well. And then the third piece is on the developer side. So a lot of a lot of software companies love AWS because it's very friendly on the developer side, and Google is great for that too in Azure. But because of all the services in the ecosystem, AWS is really great on the, if you're developing software, and just a lot of developers, have been using AWS for a long time.
Okay, great. We had a couple of questions come in about networking. And I'll ask you sort of two questions at once. You can sort of take what you want. So from Kieran, he asked, for network bandwidth, I presume you'll also need equally good network bandwidth from your network service provider. And then Kathy also asked, you talked about cloud latency. What are your thoughts about considerations of premise networking? So sort of that connection between your own network and the cloud network. Any thoughts there on how the majors compare?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are both great questions. So I see a lot of push currently on the networking vendor side on how they can support from an on-premise standpoint to the cloud side. And this goes into the first question around, how are you able to leverage on-premise, or what would be the requirement on the on-premise side to be able to ensure that you have the connection? So I absolutely have to think about the on-premise bandwidth, and then also the amount of redundancy, and then the amount of locations that you may have that you're supporting your end users. So all of that has to be looked at. Now, that being said, that's where a lot of the direct connects and the express routes, depending on the cloud provider, you can leverage the ability to directly connect to the cloud provider. So if you have your own data center build out, or you have a large amount of users on premise that you want to connect in, and then that goes into the other question, which is around on-premise networking. So I'm really a big proponent of figuring out and being able to leverage the existing technology or the existing networking vendors you have. So if you're using Cisco or using Palo Alto or whatever, like, what is the impact of that, and how are you going to use that in the public cloud? So a lot of enterprises look at extending what they already have their investment in on the networking side to say, hey, let's now have that connected on the cloud side and be able to connect there. Now, you still have to think about the latency impacts, because if you're just going straight over the internet versus doing a direct connect, you have to think about what that looks like. But overall, having the ability to connect from your existing networking and be able to extend that, and a lot of the networking vendors out there support the ability to spin up virtually their products in the public cloud as a way to kind of connect the on-premise into the cloud. So that's a great way, again, depending upon the bandwidth constraints and the latency, to be able to kind of tune and be able to leverage a lot of the functionality that these different networking vendors do great. So I work with all kinds from, Fortinet, Checkpoint, Cisco, Palo Alto, and so on. And they're all, I can tell you right now, they're all making strides into helping to solve this particular issue by providing their capabilities in not just in the public cloud, but how you can tune connections. And then the other piece, just to reiterate, is the cloud providers are providing the capabilities more and more of direct connects, from your data center or even from on-premise to their regions and their data center. So just think about that too, because that's a way to also help the overall latency issue if you can directly connect in and have the ability to cut down on any issues around that.
Gotcha. Great. Hey, well, Mike, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We've a lot of great questions rolling in from the audience, but we've got to wrap it up for a short break before our next session. So, Mike, I just want to thank you for a lot of great information there, great presentation. And I also want to thank our sponsors, Zerto, Cloud Health by VMware, and NetApp. And I'm going to kick it back to Tracy Cook for an interim.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mike. That was a great session. Really appreciate you both being here. Now we're going to go on a short break until the top of the hour. But in the meantime, I just want to let everybody know that the slides for the presentations are available on the right side of your console. So, be sure to download those if you're interested. Also, there's resources that are provided by our sponsors, and you can download those also. So we'll be back at 10 a.m. Pacific for our second session of the day entitled Cost Shootout, comparing the list prices, hidden costs, and other IT savings of the major public cloud platforms. So hold on, we'll be right back.
The second session will now begin.
Thank you. And welcome back, everyone. It's Scott Becker again, and we have another information-rich session today entitled Cost Shootout, comparing the list prices, hidden costs, and other IT savings of the major public cloud platforms. Joining us for this session is Howard M. Cohen, Sr. Howard
there is no junior.
Senior Resultant. Senior Resultant at the Tech Channel Partners Results Group. Howard will get into his background a little bit when he starts, but the reason I'm excited that Howard, that you're presenting today is because this session focuses on the budgeting and cost side of cloud and the way the major clouds compare. And the audience, I've known Howard for a long time. I was really excited to get him to do this particular session because of his focus. Over the years, it's always been a combination of technology and business. Howard really understands and gets excited about the technology trends. He's also got experience running a technology business, consulting technology businesses, and the economics of information technology. And he knows business models, business cases, hidden costs, basically all the knowledge you want in a guide to make a business decision about cloud. So Howard, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the webcast.
Thank you, Scott. It's my pleasure. I counted, and audience, tell me if you think this is right, I counted 3 age slams in that introduction. And I just wanted to point that out.
They were not slams.
Neither of my sons would appreciate me being called senior, because that would make them junior. Okay. So yes, I am Howard M. Cohen, Senior Resultant for HMC right now. I spent 35 years in the channel as an executive, half of that being in charge of sales, marketing, and business development, at which time my personal battle cry was, trust me, I'm in sales. Anyway, the other side was professional and managed services. I lived on both sides. I understood what it took to deliver great services to clients, and I understood what it took to sell them. And I understood the argument between those two and was able to really bridge the gap. About 11 years ago, I decided it was time to break out of it. 35 years was enough. And so today I write for and about the channel and technology. The channel business, as Scott pointed out. I write for many channel publications. My favorite, of course, hint, hint, my favorite, of course, is Redmond Channel Partner, where I had a column called The Changing Channel for 7 years. And I do refer to myself as a senior resultant. Resultant because I'm all about results. And that's how I was raised in the business. It's great, you made terrific effort, but you know what? I only measure you by your results. The senior is another age slam, just to point out that I'm a lot older than most people you meet in the channel these days. Okay. So what we have on the screen right now is an old software license. And for those of you who've been around the technology industry for any length of time, you probably consider software licensing to be the equivalent of rocket science. It's complex. There's lots of detail. You can really get lost in it, and many people do. Many people built their careers on software licensing, becoming experts at software licensing. So that's all good. Well, if you thought that software licensing was rocket science, wait till you get a hold of cloud pricing. It wasn't always this way, but with every passing year, cloud pricing becomes more intricate, more complex, more difficult to understand. There are more idiosyncrasies floating around. There's more gotchas, things that you have to watch out for. But of course, there's more opportunities to forge a wonderful program that will keep your costs minimal and your service levels maximal. Let's get into that a bit. This all begins with a very important document. If you have not read this document already, it's a long read. It's 4 pages. And it's NIST publication 800-145, NIST being the National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the Department of Commerce. This document is the de facto standard the yardstick, the reference point by which everybody defines cloud computing. And when you read it, you'll understand why a lot of things are called what they're called. They make more sense when they're taken in context. Well, one of the things that's said when it's talking about the general characteristics of cloud computing, one of those general characteristics is rapid elasticity. Rapid elasticity, meaning you can provision more services and release them at will. And that's great. When you need something, provision it, request it, and when you're done with it, return it, because all the resources are shared. And that's how the economies of scale are created. The thing that they don't mention in the document, but that everybody has seized upon, is that because you're requesting and releasing, you get to pay only for what you use. You're not paying for a resource at any time other than when you use it. That's great. So there's lots of great savings to be had in the cloud. And honestly, cloud met a lot of resistance at first, but the economics of scale and the economics of the way cloud works were just too irresistible. And cloud has been growing and gaining more users constantly over the past decade or more. Where do those savings come from? The first and foremost is capital investments. You don't have to buy any more computer equipment, like server class equipment, storage equipment, so forth and so on. You don't have to buy that anymore because you're not going to use it. You're using somebody else's equipment. So all of your investments go away, and you don't spend that big money anymore. Rent on a space to house all that equipment. You don't have to have a network closet or a data center anymore. Somebody else is serving you. You have none of the physical plant costs. You don't have to buy furniture. You don't have to buy fire extinguishers. You don't have to buy halon protection. You don't have to buy any of that or rent or pay for any of that. That's all gone. If you don't own equipment, you can't be powering it, so you have a much lower need for electrical power. Same with cooling. You don't have to cool equipment you don't have. You don't need extra internet bandwidth for it. You don't need to maintain it. You can't maintain something that's not there. You don't have to manage those systems, which means that your headcount drops, and payroll being a very big budget line item. Many people are very happy to see that reduced when the people that are being released are not core to their company's business. And IT is not core to their company's business in most cases. It may be shoes. It may be food. It may be heavy equipment. But whatever it is, it's not IT. This has given us a redefinition of the computer store. This is a classic computer store, and they're still out there, although they're starting to get closed. There you can find all kinds of computers, desktop computers, laptop computers, server class computers, storage devices, peripherals like printers and scanners, software, accessories. It's all there. You can go browse around and pick out what you want. Of course, you can't browse around the cloud like that. It changes a bit. Today's computer store, if you will, looks a little more like this. Whether it's Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, it's a data center. And it looks more or less like this data center. And in this data center, you get to pick out your computers. They have a whole long shopping list of computers for you to choose from. And you can choose the platform that you want and tailor it to your application, which, as we all know, everything begins with the application. There's also a wealth of services for you to take advantage of, and we'll talk a lot more about that shortly. There are storage options. There's all kinds of options, and they're all here in your cloud computer store, your cloud computer resource. You pick and choose them, and the good news is you don't have to pack them in the back of the car and take them home. They're simply available to you upon demand. And a big difference in the way that we go about shopping. Now, what you'd love to be able to do is an apples-to-apples comparison between Amazon, Google, and Microsoft and how they provide cloud services. Unfortunately, not every Apple is the same. Yeah, they're all members of the family of cloud computing services, but they each operate differently. They each have different standards. They each have different services configured different ways. Many times they call the same thing different names or use the same name to describe different things. It gets very, very confusing very, very fast. So we really can't do an apples-to-apples comparison. But we can compare and contrast these three sources of cloud services. One way is, of course, the famous Gartner Magic Quadrant, which going up and down is the ability to execute. Going across is their completeness of their vision. And you'll notice, of course, that Amazon Web Services is furthest up and to the right, meaning they're better on both. That's good news for them. Microsoft is very slightly behind them in the completeness of their vision, but Gartner considers them to be not quite as good in their ability to execute their services. And of course, Google is still in the leaders quadrant. And it's important to note, all three of the leaders are in the leaders quadrant. You'll notice in the niche players quadrant, one of the players there is maybe unfamiliar to some of you, Alibaba Cloud. There's Tencent Cloud. There are several other cloud platforms that were created on the other side of the world that are very quickly coming on shore. And you can expect to see them vying with the big three as we move forward. So Gartner has evaluated the three and compared and contrasted them this way. So you won't be surprised that when we take a look at their market share, no, Amazon has the biggest market share. I joke often that everybody thinks that Amazon is an e-commerce service that happens to also sell web services. The reality is, if you look at their bottom line, they're a web services company that happens to have an e-commerce division. Amazon Web Services is enormous. And it owns a third of the market. Now, if you look at Microsoft Azure Cloud, Google Cloud, and IBM Cloud, and you total them up, they take 32% of the market, meaning that Amazon outsells its next three competitors, which is amazing. But it's been true for several years now, and it's actually narrowing somewhat, but not as quickly as some might have you believe. See, Amazon is continuing to grow 41%. Now, you'll note that Microsoft's doing much better. They're growing by 75% year over year, and Google is growing by 83%. But you have to do the math, and when you're multiplying $2.3 billion by 83%, you're not getting quite as far as you do when you're growing by 41% of $7.6 billion. So while the rate of increase is higher, and they may be catching up to some degree, Amazon is still enjoying healthy growth and will probably stay out in the lead for some time to come unless something cataclysmic happens. And that's not so far in the forecast. Here's the problem with all of this. Frost & Sullivan did a study and found that more than half of the IT leaders they talked to think managing costs to run their cloud workloads is big. That's a major problem that they face. It's not the costs themselves, it's the management of those costs. It's hard to define them, hard to keep track of them. Frost & Sullivan predicts that the providers will address that by simply consolidating and simplifying their pricing programs. This will give users a better ability to predict and compare their costs. Yeah, somebody tell them that. So far, we have not seen that happen. Quite the contrary. We've seen prices become more complex, more difficult, and there's always margin in mystery, they say. So they've got compelling reasons why they want to do it. Hopefully that will turn around because of competitive forces. Vance and Bourne adds that 70% of CIOs say it's the sheer number of different ways to pay, the different programs that are available, and we're going to be reviewing some of those today. It makes it very difficult to select the right cloud solution. Now, I'm going to tell you that selecting the right cloud solution obeys the same rules that we've always obeyed, and that is that everything begins with the application. What is it you need to do? Let's figure out what you need to get it done. That will always be true. But then you have to go and figure out what is the most cost-effective way to do that, and that is the way that we approach pricing these days. Unfortunately, what Frost and Sullivan and Vance and Bourne are saying turns into cloud customers wasting almost half their spend. Think about that. Almost half their spend wasted because they didn't seek the right pricing programs, and they're paying for software, or they're paying for services that they don't need. And so this is a very, very big issue that needs to be focused on. And I will say that the best pre-sales engineers I've ever worked with study pricing every bit as hard as they study the technology that they represent. When they can advise their customer, when they can be a true consultant, helping their customer with the business aspects as well as the technology aspects, they are much more valuable to them. And so they become expert at weeding out the best possible way to configure pricing, just like they would configure servers for their customers. Here's the good news. The good news is there's plenty here that needs to be priced. It's good news because there's so much for you to take advantage of. There's so many services, so many new products, so many new developments all the time. Cloud computing is getting bigger and better all the time. That, to me, is really good news. The bad news, there's plenty here to be priced. As it gets better, it also gets more complex. And there's just no denying that. Unfortunately, that turns into it becoming easier to make mistakes. And that's why almost half of cloud customers are wasting half their spend. Okay, so we've been talking about pricing and there's plenty there to be priced. Let's talk about what needs to be priced. Most of you, when I talk about pricing for cloud computer services, your mind probably immediately went to subscriptions. It's the first thing anybody thinks of. It's how everybody relates to cloud services. They are monthly recurring expenses that you pay to take advantage of services. That's the price you pay for cloud computing. It's not the whole price. When you go to plan to build a cloud initiative, you need to be aware that there are three basic steps to pricing out the entire package. Upfront, the subscriptions themselves, and the ongoing costs. So let's not confuse the price with the ongoing cost. Let's start now with the upfront items, the things that have to be priced upfront. First and foremost, there's consulting. It is likely that none of you are cloud computing experts. So you probably don't really know how to begin to approach it. That's perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical. So you want to engage an expert who can help you with that. They can help you design your system so that you're not building it organically, buying things as you think you need them, but rather you're really planning for now and in the future. This includes developing your order for cloud services. As you see how complex the pricing is, you'll realize that building the initial order and ongoing orders is a complex science unto itself. rocket science, as we said at the beginning. So you need somebody who's familiar with it, somebody who knows it well, or you need to learn it well yourself. Then you come to cloud integration. One of the joys of the cloud is that you can pick and choose which cloud providers you want to obtain which cloud services from. It doesn't all have to be from one provider. Everybody used to talk about going to the cloud as if the cloud was a singular destination. It's not. It's millions now of different data centers all over the world providing different services. You can pick and choose the ones you want, but once you've done that, you've got to get them working well together. That is the ultimate definition of integration. In the old days, we used to integrate hardware and software from various different places. Now you're going to be integrating cloud services from different providers. They each speak different languages. They each speak different protocols. They each have different security standards. You've got to make sure they all work well with each other and can provide very efficient, very effective operation. One thing that many used to leave out of their planning, and some still do, is disaster planning. And right now, with what we're going through, it's very front of mind. What do we do when a disaster happens? And the good news is in the cloud, most cloud providers, the best ones certainly, have multiple cloud data centers. The big three have hundreds of them. And your data can all fail over from one to another very quickly. It's always replicated, and it's always available. So if a data center, an entire data center, becomes unreachable, there's another data center that can pick up the slack. And that's great. But a disaster recovery plan goes far beyond that. Let's say your cloud servers keep running, and they're very available. They're useless unless your users can access them, meaning you have to have a plan for where your users go, who they communicate with, how they communicate with them, and how they find another place to work where they can access your cloud computing resources. And there needs to be a plan for that, and it needs to be practiced on a regular basis. Soapbox away. Configuration. Each of these services is difficult to configure. How much do you need of everything? What are the protocols that need to be set? There's all kinds of specifications. You need an expert who can help you with that. Once that's done, you're going to need someone to help you to plan your migration. You've got a lot of data on-prem. You've got to move all that data to the cloud. Not a simple, not a trivial pursuit. This is difficult, and you need to plan it and execute it, and there are wonderful tools available to help you do that. However, you need to plan it. One of the reasons you need to plan is because there's so much of the data that you're not going to need to migrate to where it can be accessed live. It's data you haven't used in a long time, so you can archive it. You can put it into very low-cost storage and just get to it sometimes. You also need to be sure that you've got a plan for data backup. I don't care how many data centers the cloud provider has. You want your own belt and suspenders protection. You want your own alternate backup just in case. It may be illogical. It may seem expensive. It really depends upon the criticality of your ownership of the data. But many companies have found it necessary to use a separate service and separate equipment to back up their data off of their primary provider. So you need to provide for that. The other things you need to provide for are the different licenses, the different specifications, the different user IDs, all the information you need to make the services available to your users as they come onto the network. You do need to pay attention to directory management and directory design. You need a tree. You're going to be controlling who has access to what. You're going to be controlling security and authentication. Directory services is how you do it. And it doesn't go away in the cloud. It's still the easiest, most reliable way to manage resources and roles. You'll need to add users. As I just said, you'll need to assign roles and resources to each user or each group of users. This should sound familiar to anybody who's ever used directory services. Security. You are responsible for security. End of story, full stop. Yes, your provider will provide wonderful security, but at the end of the day, if the data assets are compromised, it's not your provider they're going to come for. I guarantee it. You may have to install software on client devices. Some cloud services simply make the data available, but the application runs at the client end. Happens. You have to prepare the client devices and make sure that they're ready to rock and roll. You need to deploy these to all of your users, and once you've deployed them, you need to provide orientation and training to all of your users so that they know day one how to make best possible use of their new resources. But again, you price these and your consultant delivers them to you. Must be done. It's part of the planning, and it's part of making a great cloud happen. Now we get into subscriptions. Now, I'm going to put the big three plus one on the board. Okay, the big three are compute, storage, and network. Those are the three major services that you need to subscribe to. I put analytics in there with them because the earliest days of cloud, and it's still true today, the worst thing that can happen is you get a bill for overages, overuse, and that bill is a whopper. It's got 6 or 7 zeros following the numbers, and that can be career-threatening. So you want to always know that you have cloud analytics in place to make sure you know who's using what cloud services and to what extent. You know, what projects are they being used for, which departments are using them, which individuals in those departments. You want to be able to do chargeback and billbacks. You know, you also probably are using data in this network, and you're going to want analytics to help you determine the value you can get out of that data. So analytics is far more important than most people give it credit for, and it should be prescribed along with the big three. You're also going to have to do some software licensing. The fact is you're using applications and you're using operating systems. They have to be paid for one way or another. Yes, you can rent them from the provider, or the provider can simply sell them to you outright, or you can use existing ones that you're repurposing away from on-prem and moving them over to cloud. Lots of different strategies for you to make the best possible use of every software investment. You also need to pay for database. If you're using a database application and it has a database platform, you need to pay for the use of that database platform. And finally, I've put on here services. There are a lot of services, and we'll just try to move through those as quickly as we can. So let's start with compute. Compute is the majority of your spend. Okay, you'll get different pricing for development and testing and other pricing for production. That's one way in which it breaks down. But generally, you price compute in the format of virtual machines. Virtual machines contain all the resources you need to operate a server. They're modeled after a physical server. Logically, it looks like a server to you, but you can have dozens and soon hundreds of servers running on one hardware server machine. That's, again, when you have multiple tenants, you split the price, and that's how those economies of scale are achieved. The virtual machines come in different flavors, as you saw on that chart before. Some are general purpose, just like every server that's ever lived in any small to medium business and many larger businesses. Some are compute optimized for number crunching. Others are memory optimized for use with big data and manipulating big data. There are graphic processing unit instances available for very specialized, high-velocity image manipulation projects. It's important to look to be able to customize these to match your workload. The more you can match your workload, the less you'll end up paying for each of the machines, each of the virtual machines that you subscribe to. Now, before you saw this list on the screen, of course, this deck will be available to you from the interface, as are all the others. You can certainly consult this list, but at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you links to complete calculators for each of the big three. So compute, when you subscribe to compute, compute is based on what kind of server you're looking for, how many CPU cores are in there, how much memory is in there, how much storage is in there. Geographically, where are they located? That's actually important for many reasons. Be aware that if you do transfer data from one availability zone to another, you may incur transfer fees. Transfer fees may apply. Let that be a warning to you. There are plenty of fees like that, and they'll sneak up on you. So keep an eye out for them. They're all over the place. The title of this session talks about list price. List price really can be defined here as the on-demand price. If you were simply to go to a website and order up a virtual machine right now because you just need to use it for a little while, that will incur a charge that is list price, the highest price that the vendor provides. So that is the one way in which you can assure yourself of paying list price, which is something I'm sure nobody wants to do. And there are many discount programs available. This chart, which you can again look at in the deck, specifies three of the different types of servers, how many processors are in them, how much memory is in each one, and the memory allocated is usually aligned with the purpose. And it compares the three top sellers' prices so that you can compare and contrast how they compare and contrast. Now, again, look at it when you get to the deck. But let's right now focus in on discount programs. These are based on commitment. Let's start there. Commitment is the first and foremost way that you can get a better discount. You commit to 1 year, you commit to 3 years, you'll get a better price for those years. I don't know why nobody likes 2 years, but I'm sure there's a reason. But most of them do configure 1 and 3 year programs. If you pay for it all up front, you'll get a discount. They love getting your money right up front, so they'll give you a discount. Now, of course, you're thinking, well, how can I pay for it up front if I'm only paying for what I use? The answer is that along the way, they anticipate you're going to use more than you subscribe for. And there come those overage charges. So again, watch out for that. If you surrender the ability to make any kind of adjustments to your configurations, they'll give you a discount for that. It's saving them time and trouble. They're going to give you a discount to thank you for that. So that's another way that you can earn a discount. Another way is if you can do your work at specific times of day that are more convenient for the cloud provider, they'll give you a discount for use during slack periods. They'll also sell you spare capacity from time to time on special pricing when they have it. So that's a variety of ways. As I mentioned, the pricing is different for development and testing. There are often special prices offered specifically for that purpose because they know that when you're finished developing and testing, you're going to go into production, and you're going to be paying for that. So the big three each have their own different program, and I just thought I'd put up the names for you. Amazon offers reserved instances and then convertible reserved instances where you can change them later on, but you're going to have to pay a fee for that. Azure offers reserved virtual machine instances and a hybrid use discount that's available if you happen to have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. Those of you who do have one, you know you have one. Those of you who don't, it's simply a master agreement for a wide variety of Microsoft services that you're committing to consuming. and you'll find that there are things in there that end up never getting used, and you're paying for those. But it does earn you terrific pricing on a variety of things, including cloud computing. Enterprise agreements have always been very popular. And Google offers committed use discounts or sustained use discounts. If you have a workload that is working more than 25% of the time, they will automatically apply a discount to it. It's applied automatically, which is a nice benefit. So each of them have different names for it. Each of them have different rules and regulations, different standards, but each makes available programs to you. They each make a variety of storage programs available, and in different ways. There's object storage, block storage, a plain old vanilla file system. You can build a data warehouse, a data lake. There's all kinds of different storage configurations, and the one you choose is usually based on the application that's involved. Be aware that if you're using some of their more long-term archival storage services, there may be egress charges when you try to get that data from that resource. So again, another, not so hidden, but another additional fee that may apply. Also, if you request the use of their application programming interfaces, their APIs, if you request them, you may get charged for that as well. The good news is that overall, the cost of cloud computing, this decreases as usage rises, both individually for you and in the overall in the business. And again, I think this bullet just straight onto here. Okay. So there are a variety of different names for their storage products. You really need a Sherpa to interpret all of this for you, but those are the names of the storage programs. Analytics, you want to analyze your use of network. You want to analyze your software licensing to make sure you're making best possible uses. You need to subscribe for the database. You need to choose your database based on your application, based on the fundamental characteristics of each database. And again, you need a development expert. So there's going to be a lot of people involved in your team here, and that's going to be a cost as well. Then we get to the services. Now, what I'd like you all to do right now is buckle in, because we're going to go through this pretty quickly. I have chosen Google Cloud for this first group because it's the smallest of the three. It's got the smallest list. I think they have less than 100. I think in the last session we talked about that. They have fewer than 100 services on their directory right now. I thought I'd present them to you broken out by the different categories that they fall in. So for artificial intelligence and machine learning, here are all the services that are available to you if you want to use them in the cloud. For artificial intelligence platforms and accelerators, there's several of those. For management of APIs, several of those. There are several compute-based services that you can take advantage of. Several container. Most development today is microservices in containers. Fabulously resilient, fabulously reliable, fabulously agile. There's some services emerging there as well. Data analytics. We talked about the importance of analytics. A lot of them are expressed in this list of services. There are many different databases that are available to you. Many different development tools for your developers to use as they're building software in a cloud environment. Healthcare and life sciences, specific services for the healthcare industry. Hybrid and multi-cloud is becoming huge. Each of the cloud services has its own idiosyncrasies. And so people use different cloud services for different applications or even different parts of an application. You can absolutely mix and match, absolutely use them together. And here are some services to help you do that. The Internet of Things, the global Internet of Things. There are some services here, and more are emerging even as we speak. Look at this list to grow dramatically. They provide management tools so you can manage your cloud environment just like you're accustomed to managing your on-prem environment, probably even better. There's media and gaming. For those of you who are building games, huge industry, very lucrative. There are services to help you get that done. Since you are on a network, there are networking services that you can use to do load balancing, create hybrid networks, and so forth. All those services are available. Operation services, services to help you operate your applications, operate and integrate them into your fundamental business operations. There are, of course, security and identity management services to help you make sure that the only people who get access to things are people who are authorized to use them. Identity and access, these services are an extension of that. And again, very important. User protection services to protect your users and also to protect users from you. There are serverless computing services to enable you to have no servers on-prem whatsoever and still do all your computing. Services to help you manage storage. Let's catch our breath. Okay, that was fewer than 100. Now, let's go next to Amazon Web Services. They have more than 200. All right, how many of you thought I was going to go through all these? Well, good news, I'm going to spare you that. You get the idea. This is simply the list of categories of Amazon available services. This is just the categories. And here's Microsoft's list, just the categories. There are a quantity of services underneath each of these. Each one has its own technical idiosyncrasies and its own pricing idiosyncrasies. As you add them, you need to configure them, and different configurations will require different prices. So this is where it gets really hairy, really complex, and you need to be prepared for that. Again, you're going to specify the services based on what's needed for your application, and then you're going to make sure that you price each one of them correctly. Okay, we have now priced out our subscriptions. It wasn't easy, a lot of things to consider, but it has delivered us finally at what needs to be priced in the ongoing. For those of you who are in the audience who provide these services, these are your services. These are the services you will get from your cloud consultant long term. Support services. Users need support no matter what they're using. So you will have a help desk, or you'll have a dial-up capability, or an online capability, or a mix of the three. Analytics and interpretation of those analytics. It's great to have the information. If you can't make head or tails of it, it's useless to you. So you may need help interpreting the analytics that you generate across your use of cloud. Client device maintenance. Users are going to break their laptops, period. It's just that simple. You need an Exchange program. You may still be operating out of a brick and mortar office, although after this pandemic, I think that'll be fewer and fewer of us, but those devices need to be maintained, and so that the user can keep on working. One of the most important services to make sure you've obtained is cloud capacity monitoring and management. Again, think back to those days when those big overage invoices came out and managers lost their jobs because they didn't get in front of it. You don't want to be one of those. So somebody's got to be watching the store. Maybe one of your users didn't release a resource they requested, and you're paying for it night and day while that user's on vacation. Not fun. But you can spot it if somebody's managing and monitoring your use of cloud capacity. The network performance and continuity. If you have a need for full-time computing, you need to make sure somebody's on top of that. It's certainly possible in the cloud. There's plenty of redundancy out there, but somebody has to be sure that it all works flawlessly. Availability management. It's amazing, but every time you get an invoice from a cloud provider and you then get a report of your utilization, the two will match perfectly. Every time. Isn't that amazing? If you didn't detect the sarcasm dripping from my voice, you need to keep them just as honest as you ever kept a carrier. You've got to make sure that what they're telling you you used is what you show you used. Many people have received whopping returns and whopping rebates because they proved that they were being charged for things that they weren't using. There are big service companies that have grown up just to do that for you, just to make sure that the bills you receive truly reflect the services you've used. If you haven't already, institute a cycle of periodic disaster recovery testing. Have somebody come in and run you through a fake disaster and see if everything goes off the way it should and everybody does what they're supposed to do. Rehearsal is invaluable when the time comes that you run into a catastrophe and nobody knows what to do. Prevent that. Get in front of that. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about are the gotchas. Just a few of them. You've already seen a whole bunch of them. But in terms of commitment, you're going to see pricing models that may seem very affordable to you, but they're affordable only until you decide, oh, I need to scale up. I need to get bigger. Or worst case, you need to scale down because of a business setback. You may get charged through the nose for those changes. When you commit to a period of utilization, make sure you read the fine print about the charges involved if you make any changes whatsoever. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Overages are your enemy. Make sure you know they're coming. Make sure you head them off at the pass if you can, or make sure that your financial management is aware of them before the bill arrives. There are many fees beyond the virtual machine itself. As we mentioned before, egress fees, transport fees, service fees, operating system fees. That's a small list. The list is longer and longer all the time. Cloud pricing trends. Here's the good news. There's something we call the virtuous cycle. Basically, it says that the more servers you stand up, the less you have to charge because the more resources you have available. This turns into better pricing all the time. The price of cloud computing can generally be said to be moving downward all the time. And of course, the competition between the bigs doesn't hurt that process. However, for those of you who lock in for a 1 or 3 year commitment, again, read the fine print. It may be that when that new generation pricing comes out and they've taken that virtuous cycle and translated into savings for their customers, you may not be able to change to it. They may require you to complete your commitment at the price you contracted for. Negotiate that up front. Make sure it's in the fine print that if new generation pricing comes out, you will always see it reflected in your pricing. Many of the services talk about how they'll true up at the end of a period. You pay for a subscription, and then at the end, they compare your actual use to your committed subscribed use, and you pay for the difference. Examine that very closely. Sometimes that true-up fee has people saying, that can't be true. It's a true-up fee. Of course it's true. A couple of best practices, because we're getting very close to the end of this session. Again, begin with the application. Do not shop for the best price because there's no such thing. Some are priced better for small companies. Some are priced better for enormous fortune companies. Some are priced to do database management better. Some are priced to do number crunching better. You've got to really look at each one as it applies to your application. When you begin to lay this out, price various scenarios so you can see how pricing varies within the environment you're thinking about going into. Another admonishment, thou shalt know thy workload. Know the characteristics of your workload. Know how big it is. Note how dynamic it is. How much does it change, up or down? What are the fields? I mean, there's plenty of operations you're going to perform on them. Be very familiar with your workload so you price the right storage, the right processing, the right software environment for each. Even the right operating system running on your VM impacts that. Also, take into consideration when you're doing all of this, not the tender loving care, the total life cycle of your project. You're going to have costs occurring throughout the life cycle of the project. Project them now. Understand as well as you possibly can the total life cycle cost of this project, the total cost of ownership, if you want to call it that, the TCO, but project that carefully. Compute that carefully. It will protect you in the long run. And then when you're looking at a particular service, you really need to ask yourself, is the performance of this particular service worth the price they're asking? Only you can decide if that's true. So include that in your thinking. Am I really getting what I'm paying for here? And whatever you do, remember, you're either going to grow or shrink. Nobody stands still. So leave room in your commitments for agility to make the changes as you need to. Don't lock yourself into configuration standards that you're not allowed to change. And make that elasticity available to you at any given time. Even as important as that is to try your best to avoid provider lock-in. Okay, this has been going on since the 1970s at least, and probably before that. It's been going on for 50 years or more. Vendors will sell you specific services, set things up in a specific way so you can't leave them. They become very sticky in your environment, okay? You don't want that. And you know what? If they're a good provider, they don't want that either. They don't want you staying because you have to. They want you staying because you want to. Quality should be the reason that you stay. And as you're distributing your storage, don't leave out leveling. Don't put infrequently used data in solid state storage. You know, you pay through the nose for that. Put it in slow, cheap, difficult to access storage. You're not going to access it often, if at all. So don't be paying through the nose for a high-level service to take care of low-level storage. There is cheap long-term storage available to you. And no, it doesn't have a bunch of garage doors. Okay, so I promised earlier on that I'd make available calculators. All three cloud services have extensive calculators that you can use to analyze your project or your environment, specify new services, consider comparing different services. The links are here. They will be in the deck, and the deck will be available to you. And Scott, it looks like we have about 2 minutes left for questions. I'm sorry.
No, that's great, Howard. Thanks. You know, and why don't we pop it back onto the calculator during the Q&A portion, just so
absolutely,
and keep an eye on those links. And one thing I want to mention, you know, there was a question about a clarification on a point. This whole summit will be available for replay. You'll get a link in about 24 to 48 hours that you can review it. So don't worry, you'll have plenty of chances on that. And also, you know, Howard's deck here had so much information in it. Be sure to download the deck, and you can get all the details. Especially where, you know, he was sort of racing through, you know, the hundreds of services from the different providers. Great information to have at your fingertips.
Your next presenter just pinged me to say that he loves those calculators. So
yeah, they're great.
From a deli owner, that's a rave.
True. So one question here from Dennis. It's interesting. Can the other clouds compete with Azure on Windows Server VMs pricing? Since they have and he refers to it as the AHUB program. I'm not quite sure what that refers to, but you had mentioned all the enterprise agreement. So many companies are they have infrastructure where they have an enterprise agreement. Does that give them an especially serious reason to consider Azure? Because of those price discounts.
Yeah, that's very, very. First of all, I've just myself heard about AHUB, and I'm not studied up on it, so I'm not going to represent that I am. But I think that you could make a similar statement for all three of the bigs, and for many of the others that were on that list, and even others that are smaller than was on the list of market share. There are some very small providers who've come up with very clever offerings, and they've figured out a way to make them very, very inexpensive. A variety of things go into that, which we can't get into now. But the great arbiter, this is like anything else, the great arbiter is to talk to your colleagues, other people in IT who've used these services. Ask the provider if they're offering you their services and claiming they can compete. Ask them to put you in touch with a few of their current customers. Anybody can sell Azure. A lot of providers can deliver Azure. The Azure platform was made available long ago. So there are many providers out there who are running Azure on their own infrastructure. And they may have a way, maybe they're willing to take less margin than Microsoft, but there are always ways to game the plan. So I would watch out for those. Okay, sounds good. Well, we're about up on time, so I think we'll have to leave it there. But I think this has been a really great framework, that you've provided with the, looking at the overall costs of the upfronts, the subscriptions, and then the ongoing costs, and making sure you're taking all of those into account as you look at these cloud costs from various providers. So Howard, I just want to thank you for your time and a great presentation. A lot of fantastic information. Well, thank you for inviting me to the forum. Yeah, and I also want to thank our sponsors as well. Cloud Health by VMware, Zerto, and NetApp. And I'm going to turn things back over to Tracy.
Thank you, Scott. That was a great presentation. That was a lot of information, Howard. Thanks so much for joining us today. And Scott, I'd like to thank you for moderating the first and the second session. Really appreciate that. So now we're going on another short break until, for about 5 minutes. We'll be back at about 11:05 Pacific for a third and final session of the day entitled, What Will It Take to Get You into This Cloud? So thank you, everybody, and just hold on a little bit, and we'll be right there.
Now the third session will begin.
Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome back to our Enterprise Cloud Wars Virtual Summit. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'll be your moderator for this third and final session today. This session is entitled, What Will It Take to Get You into This Cloud? And this entire event is sponsored by NetApp, Zerto, and VMware Cloud Health. Well, during this session, this third and final session, we'll be examining which of the public clouds is going to be easiest for you to get started with. I mean, there's certainly the big three, but those aren't the only ones. And certainly no technology stands alone, and the cloud is no exception. When you've made a decision to move your operations to the cloud, you bring along legacy technologies, current professional experiences, and existing development models. And not every cloud is going to be a cultural fit for every organization. So during this session, we'll take a look at the various cloud offerings and kind of consider them like college courses. You know, each one has some prerequisites, and we'll unpack what those prerequisites are. We're going to look at how your existing infrastructure can affect your decision, what your private development paradigm can mean for different clouds, what a private cloud or hybrid cloud can mean for the decision, the interoperability of other public clouds in your IT infrastructure with the major cloud platforms, what effect your existing storage will have on the ability to move data to the cloud, and how different IT management technologies will work with various cloud platforms. Getting started with any cloud certainly involves a clear-eyed look at where you are and where you realistically want to get to. So today we'll try to give you some new insights into the ways you can look at certain clouds and how to figure out which one's going to be a more natural fit for your organizational culture and IT environment. They all have certain cultural differences that may make one more suitable for your organization than the others. Well, our featured speaker today is Nick Cavalancia. Nick has more than 25 years of enterprise IT experience, and he is a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP with a focus on cybersecurity. He's an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist. He has earned MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI certifications. He's authored, co-authored, and contributed to nearly 24 books, and regularly speaks and writes and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies today on a variety of topics. He's also the dad of a hockey goalie like me. Always great to have you back, Nick.
You as well, Leif. Is your son playing yet? Mine is.
He actually heads out to Iowa for a big tryout next week.
Wonderful. Best of luck to him.
And also, Nick, did I see something on Facebook that you've just been recognized as a Microsoft MVP again?
Yeah, third time. I'm very, very proud of that. It's an honor to do
Fantastic.
that. There's, I think, 240 of us or something in the world, so that's quite an accomplishment. I'm very honored.
So, yep, as indeed. We're in good hands today, ladies and gentlemen. All right, before we get rolling, I just want to remind you of a couple of housekeeping items. Again, we strongly urge you to submit questions during the presentation, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session. You can post a question using the question field to the left of a slide window. Just type your question in there and hit submit. And also, as Tracy mentioned and Scott mentioned, this entire summit's being recorded. So you'll be able to review this again or pass it along to share with a colleague. All right, Nick, let's dive into our exploration of which of the public cloud platforms an organization should consider. But starting at the very beginning, once they've made that initial decision to move to the cloud, how should it prepare? What are some of the first steps it needs to take before actually moving to the cloud?
That's a good question here, because you're trying to figure out what's going to best fit. There's obviously you take these sort of promises of the cloud, the accessibility and availability and durability and all the other ilities that go along with the cloud, right? And you take those promises and you go, oh, everything's going to be better in the cloud. It's going to be, I'm going to be better looking and taller and, whatever, if I put stuff in the cloud because it's awesome. And the reality is you've got to start with those and look at those promises and figure out which ones you're actually attempting to take advantage of. Is it like lowered cost? Is it going CapEx instead of OpEx?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. But to kind of sort of more answer your question of like what parts are most suitable, and thinking of it, sort of from that perspective, if you will. I think the idea here is that you've got to think about workloads that they can take advantage of. Like, let's start with the simple services, virtual machines, storage, that kind of something that's very commodity-ish. I'm making up a word. I can do that from the speaker. I can do whatever I want. I mentioned CapEx and OpEx, and maybe taking advantage of that. That makes a lot of sense. Where it's not so much about the workload, but maybe, for example, I just talked to a customer that has 22 different locations, and they were getting to a point where they had to do a hardware refresh, and so now they're like, all right, do we spend $250,000 on new hardware, or do we put some of this stuff in the cloud? Right, and so that's an easy CapEx to OpEx kind of discussion there, and then there's also sort of the issue of shared responsibility. And I'm sure that all of you in the audience, you're very familiar at this point, hopefully, with the shared responsibility model. The lower parts of the stack are all kind of handled by the cloud vendor, depending on what kind of service you're looking at. If you're thinking of something like all the way to Microsoft 365, they're controlling basically the hardware, the networking, the operating system, the applications. All you're doing is just sort of utilizing the service. But then you might be doing infrastructure as a service, and now you're really more worried about something that's closer to the hardware level or somewhere in between. Some of the things that are not suitable for the cloud that should be considered before moving there would be maybe applications that really sort of, I'm going to call them latency sensitive. I don't know. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but if you have one where it's just really you need lightning fast response. You're the New York Stock Exchange or something, and and you're worried about latency, and you can't achieve the same latency. Right. You can't take that delay in getting your response back. That's one thing. I think workloads that are dependent on on-premises services. You can set up a VPN or some kind of private connection or something between a cloud provider and your on-premises infrastructure. But in some cases, it may not be. It's not the reason to move it up there. That's sort of moving it up there for the sake of moving it up there, and you're just adding this layer of complexity that doesn't need to be there. And then I think anything where the users aren't, I'm going to kind of say everywhere, which, I heard the last presentation a bit and a little bit of a discussion there very briefly about, pretty much everyone's everywhere now, people working from home, no one's really, residing out of a bricks and mortar building. Obviously some people are, and there's lots of companies that still do that, but there's a material portion of the workforce that's now remote. So, but in cases where, like, everybody's in the, Flagstaff office, well, then in Flagstaff, our data center is, why would I stick it in the cloud just for the sake of the cloud? Again, it still might be cost effective. Maybe latency is not an issue. You have to kind of weigh all these issues out. But there are some considerations, like I said, that definitely kind of paint a picture of these could go to the cloud very easily, and then these ones, maybe you should really be thinking about it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Yeah, and I like the talking about that shared services model. That's something a company certainly needs to consider as well. To what degree are they comfortable, being responsible for certain aspects of it, or do they want to maintain as much responsibility as they can? So
or the flip side. Oh wait, you'll do it? Oh, cool, take it. It's yours.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly.
I don't want to do it. Who works for a living? Anyone? By a show of hands.
Yep.
Want to work for a living? Anyone? No, raise their hands. Exactly.
Yep.
So
absolutely. Now, I know you certainly touched on some of this just now, what to move first. You've certainly touched on which parts are more suitable to move to the cloud, and a little bit about what's less likely to work. Is there anything specifically that organizations should really be careful of moving, that really pose a potential risk or something like that?
Well, there's a discussion around maybe security being an issue. Certainly, every major cloud provider has a plethora of all kinds of solutions. And I'm not even here to, even though I'm a Microsoft MVP, I'm not here to tout just the Azure cloud. All across the board, they have a wide range of security solutions. So I think it's more when issues of like maybe data jurisdiction or compliance issues, or if I'm worried about the data being accessible because it's in the cloud and I'm not exactly sure who has access to it, things like that, that kind of comes in play. Those are some of the factors. And then, I've heard instances where there were proprietary database apps. This is a fringe example, by the way. But database, on-premises database, hardware-based, servers, or true box, not a VM, and that particular application, if I remember correctly, it was a homegrown application internal to a business. It just didn't run well on VMs.
Jeez.
And so then that doesn't mean you can't go to the cloud, because there are cloud providers that will provide you with a box. But it just, it may or may not be the right one. Certainly, it's not the one to start with. That's for certain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That might be something they'd move later, at a later phase.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, moving right along, we're certainly looking at the cloud platforms. You got to start with the big three. What would you say are some? I've heard. I was having a conversation with a gentleman that he was at a training organization. They provide IT training, and he was sort of generalizing. And now I'm sure this is an oversimplification, but he was talking about the strengths of the big three, and he said, Microsoft is really good and well tailored if your organization is using the whole Microsoft stack and conveys some benefits because of that. Google is really good for more advanced detailed things like AI and ML, more development platforms, and AWS just kind of does everything well. So again, starting off with that, I'm sure that's a wild oversimplification, but from your perspective, what would you say are the biggest pillars of strengths and weaknesses of those big three?
I was going to joke and go, well, you answered the question. Thank you very much. Next question.
Okay, moving right along.
Okay. I would say I'm gonna actually go and oversimplify it even more.
All right.
Because they are really so similar in terms of the services that are provided. I mean, there are those outliers you mentioned, like AI. Some are better at DevOps, some are better at databases. The machine learning stuff you mentioned. I mean, some of that stuff definitely comes into play. Yeah, but there's a couple of factors I think that sort of differentiate them, and it's not necessarily, hey, do you have, I'll just stick with AI because it's a great enough example that everyone understands what that means. Sure. Do you have AI? I need AI, and most people don't need AI, so that's fine. Unless there's just a lot of data in front of, they hire a data scientist and blah, 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 all that stuff. So the factors that I think that kind of come into play where you're trying to decide maybe, I'm going to answer this question a little differently, but sort of where each one might be best suited for the individual in the audience. For you guys in the audience, what do you need at your organization? The answer isn't, just pick, and I name one of the big three. That's not the answer, because you can't do. Everyone has a very specific need. So I think the first thing is looking at the cost structures. And I didn't say cost; I said cost structure. So what I'm thinking about here is the pricing actually obviously does matter here. Nobody has an unlimited budget unless, of course, you're a startup company and you got your VC money, then you're good to go. But you're trying to take the specific needs that you have from on-premise, and you're trying to fit it into an offering that may or may not align perfectly. And I mean, there's still, even within that context of even that one example, of this one factor of cost structures, there are still a lot of similarities across the big three, but you just kind of look at this. The ludicrous example I love to use is, let's say that you've got a need to host a VM up in the cloud, and you need 5 cores. You need a 5-core processor. Yes, I know that doesn't make just going with it. You can't get that. I need 5 cores, man, and otherwise this thing just doesn't run well. And so then you go to the whatever cloud provider, and they go, no, we've got 2. And we've got 4, and we've got 8. You're like, but I need 5. And if you can find someone that's got a 5-core tier of offering, that probably, and you look at the cost structure therein, you might go, it's best if we just actually get the 5-core offering over on whatever it is, major cloud provider A, whoever that is. But then you might also go, oh wait, I can go look at the other 2 and go, wait, I can get an 8-core and I'm only spending an extra $1 a month, or whatever it is. You have to kind of look at those things to figure out, based on your needs, what the cost structure, what the tiered pricing looks like, that kind of thing, and kind of keep that in mind. I think the other part is something that you kind of touched on, and we joked about a little bit. That's sort of the combination of what would be considered traditionally complex services. So like the AI, the DevOps, those kinds of things. If they've done a really good job doing that, and in this case, like I'm thinking about DevOps right now for a second, and I'm thinking about the operation where developers need a lot of automation. They don't want to do a lot of work. They just want to develop. And then IT goes, well, I don't want to do your crap for you. I want to do something. I have other things I need to be doing, security and compliance and, audits and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to keep, provisioning you the VMs you need. So then it becomes like a question of, great, well, if you have like a DevOps environment as part of your cloud offering, to any of the big three, what does it look like from automation? Now you're thinking about your business needs and you're kind of applying it toward the technology going, will the technology meet my needs? Not the other way around. Never do it the other way around. Start with business needs, work towards technology, always. And then
absolutely.
I think the last thing I'm thinking of here is the larger organizations that have a lot of hands in the cloud soup. So you've got disparate IT teams, you've got disparate development teams. Everyone's got a credit card and an AWS ID or something, right? And they're all logged in doing whatever they're doing. And maybe if you can consolidate some of that stuff and take advantage of better licensing options if that exists, that's obviously a much larger undertaking and not simple to do. But there could be a benefit there. And there also is a factor that I'm somewhat implying you're already in Cloud A. So are you really going to go move to Cloud B just because you get a better price? It depends. I mean, if it's half the cost and you do the math and it's, it doesn't cost that much to move everything, or you move it over a course of months, or I don't know. It's just something to kind of keep in mind. So if you're basically at IBM VMs, then you can just basically. I think the idea is that the technical points are going to probably push you over because the costs will be really, really close. Like let's say you mentioned, the idea if you're already running Microsoft, you probably stay in Azure because Azure AD, perfect. I can synchronize. I got one directory. I can augment that with single sign-on and MFA and blah blah blah. Let's tack all these things on. That works perfect. But if the needs are more complex, then obviously it's going to come down to first whether the cloud provider has the technology that meets the need, like the AI or whatever it is, and then second, if the cost structure aligns with the budget. So it's a very long-winded answer of basically going, look at what your needs are, find a provider that meets those needs.
That makes sense. Now, are there any particular situations for which any of the big three aren't suitable?
I would say if an organization needs assistance, so you need more managed services, maybe you're looking at a smaller cloud services provider that still utilizes like a tier 5, like there's the Switch data center over in Las Vegas, tier 5 data center. It's outstanding. You're not going to get any better than that for the most part. And, somebody uses that and you get some professional services and you get some help with whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's, it could be something like SOC as a service, or it could be something on the helping provision VMs and be helping with the issue of the DevOps and their needs and the provisioning and deprovisioning or whatever it is. But maybe that would be where these guys aren't, because that's not what they do. You need someone else to help you with it. So maybe that's one factor I can think of.
Okay. That sounds good. Makes sense. All right. Well, that's, again, we had to touch on the big three, but those aren't the only three. Looking at some of the other guys, if you will, the other public cloud platforms, IBM Cloud Services, the Adobe Creative Cloud, VMware itself, the Oracle Cloud. What are some of your thoughts on some of those guys?
First off, point of contention, Adobe Creative Cloud is more the 20 applications or whatnot that Adobe has, and you can sort of
that's true.
It's not apple to apple.
Right.
That's okay. They not having interns write your questions. I'm just teasing away. But I think the simple answer is I wouldn't exclude any public cloud provider. I think there's obviously a human element of like, I'm not going to go look at 27,000 cloud providers. I don't have that much time. I have other things to do. I'm an IT professional that has, you're already pulled, all you guys in the audience, you ladies and gentlemen, you're always pulled in a million directions anyway. So you can't, but I get it. But at the same time, I think the fact of the matter is, everyone's got to figure out how each of these clouds differentiate themselves. Maybe at a top level, at a very high level. What are they saying they do differently? Maybe IBM says we do it better, or whatever it is. I don't even know what their mantra is. But let's say they say that, and you're like, your business is all about having lots of database-based applications. Well, then you probably should look at them, because you figured out from the high level that's the thing that differentiates them. And then you got to figure out that price and functionality, tier of service, the SLAs. All those things have to come in here. And I think it's worth looking, like I said, at any cloud provider. Even the smaller ones, the ones you're naming are not so smaller, but they're not considered the big three.
That's true.
And then like I mentioned, the ones that even offer managed services. Everyone's got to figure out what their differentiation is. And the big three, the simple answer is I need commodity. Okay, then go to the big three. And there's nothing wrong with it. You figure out which one you need. If not, then you start a little deeper.
Yep. Yeah, if a company's needs are more basic, if you will, and they just need like commodity cloud storage and management, then some of the big three probably would do the trick. Yeah.
Agreed.
It's a good way to think about it. Yeah, I think the point here, I think in looking at all of these different platforms, I think the point is, and the point's been hammered, all day, the organization really needs to consider all their needs, what's important to them first, before they make that decision. It's not just throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks.
Totally agree. The idea of organizations saying, like, we're going to go cloud first. Well, why are you going cloud first? Nothing. No. Just why are you going cloud first? Because that's huge. I mean, cloud first could also just mean from now on, anything we build, we're going to build in the cloud. Okay. I mean, that kind of makes sense. You're starting to go through the digital transformation that started, 7 years ago or something. We started using that term. That's fine. But just blindly going, we're going to be in the cloud. Why? Isn't necessarily everybody. But obviously, I think everybody here on the call today knows there's someone's going to get some kind of benefit from the cloud, even if it's do nothing but let's say just use like Microsoft 365 or something. Sure, it does simplify some things and maybe can save some cost, et cetera, et cetera. But I agree with you. You can't just blindly do it, but at the same time, you have to have a reason why.
Yep, absolutely. A considered decision for sure. So, all right, and as part of that decision, what are some of the factors that should make an organization consider adopting a hybrid cloud platform as well, including the private cloud as well as the public cloud?
I'm going to assume that most of the people on the call today are already hybrid. I think I exhibited at Ignite last year and talked to almost 3,000 people who came by the booth, that sort of thing. And by and large, the stories that I kept hearing about, what are they doing these days? What are the problems they're having? That kind of thing. A lot of it, I kept hearing over and over again. It's like, like for example, it was a Microsoft show, it was Ignite, so I'd hear hybrid AD, which means hybrid cloud to some degree. Insert to whatever degree there. So I'm assuming that most do to some degree are hybrid, even if it's nothing more than using Azure AD, use a little bit of Microsoft 365, whatever, and now you're trying to figure out what to do with the rest of your stuff. Or some of you also, there's probably good material percentage, I'm going to guess like a quarter to a third of you, already have workloads in the cloud somewhere, and this is more about, do I have the right one? Should I move it somewhere else? That kind of thing. So maybe this question doesn't entirely apply to you. Sit back, check your email for a minute or something, and I'll answer the question anyways for the folks that are really trying to figure out, do I go hybrid or not? And I think the decision to go hybrid generally ends up being the result of sort of one of two things. Either sort of on the one hand, an organization is trying to maybe dip their proverbial toe in the cloud waters, in which case you pick something that really fits the cloud really well, workload fits the cloud really well, and you put it in the cloud. Fine, that kind of thing. Or the other end of the spectrum sort of be there's this need to have a specific application in the cloud, but then there's this other one that really needs to be on-prem. Like you're defining for yourself, workload A has to be in the cloud because it's customer facing. We need to have redundancy. We need to have it across multiple geos, blah, blah, blah. But then we have this internal proprietary app that the accounting department uses, again, in Flagstaff, Arizona. Just sticking with that. I don't even live in Flagstaff. Sure. I just picked it out of my head. But, they work there, and why would I put that in the cloud when everybody's there? Now, again, COVID, everyone's working remotely. Okay, then maybe we move it. But you guys in the audience hopefully get my point. And I think in with sort of the latter is the default, where there's something that maybe could be better in the cloud and something that's better on-prem, and that's why we're hybrid. I think that's where most organizations end up falling into. That's probably that other, my guess, of a third to half of the audience that's already there. That's probably why. They figured application X could be in the cloud, but application Y has to stay on-prem, whether it's due to budget or on-premises needs or whatever the case is. And so in either case, I think the thinking that the cloud is going to do a better job addressing the operational needs, at least for that one workload, or they wouldn't have considered it in the first place. And so for, I think, you guys, if you guys in the audience are already trying to consider this, that's sort of what I think you need to be just thinking about whether or not you do a better job in the cloud. And the factors, to answer your question, sort of what factors, I think this revolves around the use of cloud cases, where on-premise still kind of remains the picture, but the cloud cases, customer-facing apps, back archiving, DR in the cloud, data jurisdiction, those kinds of things. There's a reason where the cloud is so compelling that it's worth the added complexity to go hybrid. I think that's whatever that is, that's the factor.
Right. Okay.
I saw you note about beeps. I don't have any beeps on my end. I'm not sure what that is.
Okay. Well,
if anybody else may be on mute, maybe they've got a beep, but I'm not beeping over here for some reason.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully it's just something in the phone line. Anyway, all right. So we talked about the big three and some of the other clouds and the possibility of going hybrid and the probability of going hybrid, really. Expanding on that, what sort of factors would make an organization consider adopting multiple public clouds? That seems to be a bigger and bigger thing.
Well, yeah, and I think this is really an easy one. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule that says you have to stick with one provider, you know. I mean,
yeah, that's true.
It doesn't say, oh, we found that you're using Azure, we're cutting you off. I mean, that doesn't happen. So, and obviously everyone knows that, but the idea here is that you're addressing those operational, those technical requirements, that kind of thing, budget requirements after that, and then you're just determining which one's the best choice. And I say that with a sort of an acknowledgement that we're talking about adding in a level of complexity by having multiple clouds. Now, you have to learn slightly different skill sets in terms of this management console versus that management console. You have two sets of billing. I mean, it adds complexity to the business, and that doesn't always help. But even so, that should sort of be addressed when you're thinking about, again, I started by saying like the operational, the technical, and then the budget requirements. I'm thinking you're probably thinking about that when you start with the operational requirements and go, is this worth it? Is it worth going to the cloud? And it might be, because in some cases there's a service that's not offered by a given provider, and you're just going to have to go somewhere else. You know, your organization started off in IBM's cloud, and now you need, I don't know what it is, something that only AWS has. Well, then obviously you have to go to that cloud. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
Deal with the complexity. You're not going to move the entire organization over to AWS, just that one workload to be done with it. So I think the factors really come back to like the operational, the technical, and then the budget requirements, and then just figuring out if it makes sense or not. It's really that simple. Yeah.
I think some of the other benefits conveyed by the multiple clouds are, certainly backup and redundancy. If you're going to store similar workloads in different clouds just for safety's sake, and also a little bit of flexibility. But like you said, it inherently adds some complexity. So.
I would agree. I'll also add on the issue of like redundancy and that sort of thing. Obviously, every cloud vendor has ways to replicate across geos and things like that. So they already have services, and so for those in the audience that are thinking of it, and I'm not arguing with you, Leif. I'm just sort of adding to the conversation. No. I'm assuming that if that's a really big issue, then it's already been addressed by thinking about the operational. Picking the right vendor that has that ability to replicate and whatnot outside of a particular geo for redundancy purposes.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Now we touched on this a little bit briefly, talking about the multiple clouds, but the skill sets, the IT operational skill sets within the company. What sort of skills might the IT staff have to upgrade or improve to be better suited to managing their new cloud operations?
I think the answer is probably not as complex as the question makes it seem.
Okay.
I go back, and I say 28 years, and I started on Novell NetWare 2.2. If anybody goes that far back with me, it was NetWare 2.2 on a 26 in non-dedicated mode. And there's somebody hopefully that's smiling right now because I haven't heard that phrase uttered in like 20 years. So it's a really slow machine by today's standards, and you could run it either as a server or as an actual DOS machine at the time. So and I learned that, and then learned NetWare 3.1 and NetWare 4.0, and then eventually Windows NT, and the skills that I had did translate. It really became more about management consoles than anything, and that eventually the Active Directory, Win2K, and that sort of thing, and then of course into like Azure AD and Microsoft 365 and so on. And for someone that's brand new to IT, let's say you're 5 years or less, you still know a tremendous amount already, and you're fine. It doesn't discount you at all. You learn after a certain number of years, and I think it's somewhere around that 3, 4, 5 years time frame. Everything sort of starts clicking where you realize instead of trying to learn something new, you just learn the difference. Oh, this is just like Azure, except for an AWS, I have to do X, whatever it is.
Press this button instead of that button. Yeah.
Right, and so I think it's more about management consoles, feature sets, what's possible. I'm talking down to like the real granular functionality. Like I'm trying to run a report to prove that we're GDPR compliant. How do I do that in AWS versus how do I do that in Azure? Or whatever. And I think it really kind of translates into that. There's always going to be platform specifics to learn, but I think the biggest skill needed is probably more so understanding what the cloud platform or platforms, going back to the last question, what they can and can't do for you, but that you would normally do yourself but may not want to do. So what is it that they can do? Can they do the automation for me? Can they do the reporting for me? Can they whatever? We talked a little bit about security, but just kind of using that as the example here, most cloud vendors have, a whole bunch of security solutions in place. They've got endpoint protection, and they've got stuff that'll do even intrusion detection, and the list kind of can keep going on. And they have that in their arsenal, and that could in some ways, I'll say it wrong, but I'll say it anyways, replace the on-premises counterparts. I don't mean necessarily they're going to put those on-premises, but I mean for the workloads in the cloud, I don't need to try and use on my VMs my on-premises based solutions. I might want just go with the ones in the cloud. But if you're just the VM admin, as it were, and you're not really aware of all these other things, you're probably missing out on mastering some of the other parts of what I would sort of consider an evolving ecosystem of offerings and solutions. And so it's more about broadening your perspective there. And I think that's the first thing. The skill set is, it starts with what else can I do in certain here. And if you go with a smaller cloud provider that's doing hyperconverged infrastructure and everything's being done through some kind of console for an HCI platform of some kind, a lot of this stuff is really super simplified. You can set up a VM in 4 seconds, kind of a thing. It's just like a right-click, new VM. You pick a couple options and create, and it's done. And you're up and running, and it's already automatically redundant and whatever else. So I think it just really depends on you understanding what you can do and can't do. And then from there you learn, the consoles and the details that are necessary.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah. So it's not so much acquiring new skills, but your existing skills kind of evolving.
Yeah, you are. You're evolving them to understand, this is exactly the same. I just need to check the button that says X instead of Y, as the case may be.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, once a company has really started moving stuff into the cloud, they've made their first moves. They're getting rolling. What are some of the operational best practices they should follow? Once they've got those first few workloads running in the cloud.
Yeah, I saw this question, and my first inkling was to actually kind of roll the clock back a little bit and start before even moving. And I think that's kind of important. I think the thing here is to understand performance, budget, and resource requirements. Let's take the example of the just wants to dip their toe in the cloud waters, and they want to put a workload up, or they have or we're now going cloud first, moving forward, so it's the very first workload. Whatever it is, we're starting with workload number 1. You want to think about the performance, the budget, and the resource requirements for that workload, as the case would be. And I always suggest testing well before moving. You might want to try replicating after the cloud, that kind of thing. Lift and shift is a great strategy, but it can't be blindly done. That's not going to work. I'll use it again. My need for the 5-core VM, right? If I just lift and shift and it's up there, it's going to cause the choice for a 4-core tier of pricing to lack. The result is you're lacking the needed performance, meaning you really need to go to 8. But you didn't budget right, because you didn't talk to the CFO first to go, all right, we can't actually run the 5-core application on a 4-core system up in the cloud, or whatever the case is. So I think operational best practices is first, do some testing, consider performance versus cost. I think in those ways. Otherwise, you'll have already migrated, and then you're sort of stuck until the next budget cycle with a VM that doesn't work very well. And then I think also in that same instance, thinking about before moving to the cloud is thinking about if you were going to right-size anything, because there is a cost functionality of like, if you think of the overutilization, all you guys in the audience, you all have VMs where you went ahead and said, oh, let's just give it 2 terabytes of storage. And then you're using, I don't know, half a terabyte or something, whatever it is, right? Or you think you need 4 cores, you're really not even using those 4 cores to anywhere near peak utilization ever, if at all, and you really could scale that down. Right-sizing the workloads is going to be a whole lot easier when you're on-prem, mostly because, in general, as a general statement, without regard to specific technology, the virtual environments and their ability to manage on an on-prem environment tend to have a little bit more flexibility and functionality than you would find in the cloud, because the cloud's trying to commoditize and give you your 80-20 of most of the options you would need, but not everything. And so I would suggest that once you've chosen where workload A, as it were, is going to reside, so we're going to put this in whatever it is, Azure, Google, AWS, anyone else, doesn't matter, make sure that you have an understanding of what it's going to take to ensure that workload A is actually going to function in the cloud the same way it did on premises. So that's things like, does latency impact the customer experience? If people if people are waiting too long, what are they going to do? Like, if all of us open a web browser, go to a website, and it takes 6 seconds to load the page. How many seconds into that 6 seconds are you gone? You're like, forget it. I don't need to see that clickbait article that badly anyways. I don't care what so-and-so is doing with their lives. And you close it. You're not going to wait. And same thing. If this is a customer-facing application, you want to have a good experience. Those kind of things. So you want to make sure that it's going to have the same performance as it did on premises, and then that, of course, can have an impact on cost. So a little different answer than where you were going, but that's the thing I think
is a good one.
Important.
Yeah. No, that makes good sense. Makes good sense. All right. Well, we've given a great overview and covered some great things here, Nick. Any final thoughts you may have? Anything you think we might have missed, or anything you want to hammer home again? Or?
Yeah. Two things that we haven't talked about.
Okay.
One I touched on just ever so briefly, but I want to dive into. That's compliance. You've got regulations like GDPR and CCPA. And if you don't know what those are, better look them up.
You're in trouble.
There it comes. And they outline some pretty specific requirements. I mean, GDPR is like absolutely best at this. I used to laugh at like HIPAA. I mean, written in 1996. You can't fault the people that didn't know anything about computers. And I think if I remember correctly, in HIPAA it actually says the words, and I think I'm quoting. I might be wrong, but I'm either maybe paraphrasing really close. And that is, it says like one of the requirements is establish and maintain levels of security. Oh, okay. I'm making everyone admin, and I'm going to maintain. Okay. I'm done. Checkbox. I'm compliant. You can't tell me I'm not, right? But GDPR is a really good example. Really specific about you have to define who is going to have access and who can review it, and that's going to hold that have a certain set of rights to come back and actually review and audit a certain period of time. I mean, there's all that kind of stuff, and then really good fine data around fines. You know that there's teeth in those things. CCPA is ridiculous, $100 to $750 per record per incident or something ridiculous like that. I mean, it really hurts. And so the idea is you're putting workloads in the cloud. The potential's there. It's going to impact your ability to guarantee that nobody else has access to the data, and to go back to the shared responsibility model. And if you're, let's say you go in private cloud with a managed service provider, and I'm not pooing on managed service providers. That's not my goal here, but just I'm providing a scenario where you go, that's plausible. They manage the hardware. They manage the hardware. They have the equivalent of the access to the physical box, going back to sort of the old data we had virtualization. They added in, do you want that or not? Is that okay? Or do you have some means to make sure, or they put something in place to make sure there's some kind of encrypted environment, something that only you have the key as the customer, whatever it is. I don't know. But something along those lines where you're making sure that truly when you have requirements, that the regulations that are saying, you must know exactly who has access. Well, if somebody else does, technically speaking, then you don't. You don't actually know who has access, and that's a problem. So I'm thinking about that. And then the other thing I'm thinking about here is that we didn't really talk about was just the issue of storage and tiered storage. And I just think that the idea of storage being such a commodity, sometimes we just go, and I used the example, just a minute or two ago of like, just give me 2 terabytes. That's it doesn't matter. It's so cheap, nobody cares. But that adds up over time, especially if you're in a very large organization. And you've got, again, back to my earlier example today, you've got, 100 people that all have a credit card, a company credit card, and they're all spinning up VMs and overutilizing storage. That's a big culprit from a cost perspective. And then it ends up also being wasteful for like backups if those particular workloads have to be backed up, if they have to be migrated, or you need to have the data moved because maybe it's test data that's used by development and they want to have a replicated copy moved over to this other VM and blah, blah, blah. All these things. If you have orphaned storage because it wasn't a primary storage container when you deleted it or deprovisioned VM, it still exists. And you got this 2 terabytes sitting out there that nobody knows what it's for and you're still paying for it. Those things come in play as well. And the reality is, and I'm thinking of storage as both specifically, hey, everyone think about storage, but also as the example, realize that when you're on premises, if you overutilize on premises, nobody cares because you already have the hardware you have. If you stay within the confines of the hardware you have, it doesn't matter. It doesn't cost you anything. But the moment you go to the cloud, day one, you're paying for every single thing that you don't need that you're using. And so just kind of think of it that way, that we've got to make sure we're paying attention to those things, because eventually, like I talked to one company where they actually use what they call shameware, and it's not software. They say instead of using software to try and get people to start deprovisioning or right sizing their overutilized processor and storage and whatever, they use shameware. They run reports every day and post it up that says, John is using 4 processors over on this machine, and he runs an average of 11% utilization. It's to embarrass people, and I don't know how to right size and stop using all the extra, whatever. And it's silly, but at the same time, it's kind of sad. Like, we have to go that far, but at the same time, the people who are consuming these resources don't care about cost, and that's okay. That's not their job. The job is to care about doing the thing they're trying to do, DevOps, or spinning up a new VM to install an application if it's one of the IT folks, or whatever it is. But realize that ultimately there's going to be this cost factor where there's that new thing you need to do 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, and there's no money because no one bothered to kind of manage it properly once you got there. So I hope that helps us a couple things, because it's been
being burned up along the way.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure between capacity and cost. You don't want to run out of capacity, but you certainly don't want to waste money while you're providing it. So.
Agreed. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. I think that'll be a huge help in helping people kind of make their decisions and determinations as they get ready to move to the cloud or even expand their existing cloud footprint.
Good.
All right, we've got a few questions that have come in here. Well, here's a nice basic question here for a company that's just getting going. What are some of the best practices for moving to the cloud? What are the steps to follow as best practices? I think we've certainly touched on that a little bit, but
I'll probably re-summarize or just make a summary. I don't know. Whatever. I'm gonna repeat myself slightly. Taking a couple pieces from what we talked about today. I think it's starting with whatever workload you're looking at. Determine what the organizational needs are. Like, for example, we need this workload to be highly accessible, or we need it highly available. Maybe you have something, for example, that doesn't need to be high availability at all. It's just you want to put it in the cloud because it's cheaper. That kind of thing. Yeah. What are those organizational requirements that are outside IT, but it's like, go find out what the technical specs are that would meet the organizational requirements. Then look at the performance requirements. If in such that's actually appropriate, like if you're just moving to a software as a service or something, it doesn't matter. You're throwing data into, again, Microsoft 365 or Salesforce or something. So that's irrelevant. But if it's an actual workload, you're looking at the performance requirements. Identifying the cloud providers and seeing what their tiers of offerings look like. And it's really complex. And I apologize. And if you're just starting your toe, it's going to be a whirlwind. And I feel for you. Even I don't want to do that. But and then figuring out which one is going to best meet your needs. And the reality is, if you're in your mind, it's one of the big 3. If that's you, and your needs are very simple, it almost, and there's no compelling technical requirement, it doesn't matter which one you pick, is the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
If there is, your example earlier was like, I think you mentioned someone saying like if you're using Azure AD, and then it makes more sense. There's again an organizational requirement. So we've already kind of addressed that at the beginning. But if not, it's pick one. Close your eyes, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and pick one. But if your needs are far more complex, such as I need some additional assistance because we're not cloud experts or we're not cybersecurity experts in the cloud or whatever it is, then maybe you're not looking at the big three at all, and you're looking for someone that's more of a cloud service provider that does have excellent data centers underneath their belt, and they have a huge bench of people with a lot of expertise over the years. Hopefully that helps.
And they could help guide the company along, if they're not feeling comfortable doing it themselves.
Right, and there's on that note, there's varying degrees of what a cloud service provider will and won't do. Some of them are more like, we help you a little bit, and some of them are white glove. Some are more we're going to help the management. Some will do the architecture and the development, and the planning and the execution. And, it sort of just depends. And again, you're back to trying to decide what the needs are and who's going to best meet it.
Yep. Sounds good. Well, kind of a similar question here. Are you aware of any, discovery or feasibility or assessment checklists that can help a company as they're considering making their move or migration?
No.
They're not.
I'm trying to think of,
that would be a great thing to cook up.
Yeah, I'll have that done in 15 minutes. A feasibility checklist. I'm assuming what that means, because I'm also trying to just interpret that a little bit, is you're looking at a given workload and trying to determine is it best to put it into the cloud. And I don't know of one that exists. I think some of the things that I definitely talked about today, performance, cost, your budget, latency, the added benefit or the added needs for things like redundancy, the high availability, all that kind of comes into play. And then that's probably the short list. It's not a comprehensive list by any means, but I had to.
Yep. Yeah, I know that the second presenter finished up. He had those cost calculators for the big three. I wonder if they were thinking of something like that, but more like a step-by-step checklist, if you will, or something like that. So, we should put those up. I could sell them for a ton.
You get started, and I'll jump in afterwards.
All right. Good enough. Are there any considerations, any special or unique considerations for smaller businesses when selecting a public cloud?
Okay, good question. Smaller businesses means smaller IT staff.
Yeah, smaller IT staff. Their needs are probably less. That kind of thing.
Yep.
Not a big 5,000 person company that's got operations across the country.
No, and that I think there's an interesting opportunity. There's the obvious if you have very small needs, you can just go ahead and spin up a couple of VMs and pick your public cloud provider that you want to use. Yeah. That's true. I think though what I find in medium-sized businesses that have let's say 100, 200 people, even down to even like 50 people, especially with the current climate, the need to somehow go, okay, people are not coming in the office, so I need to figure out how to make all this stuff work remotely. They're not saying in the cloud. They don't know in the cloud. They're just like a managing partner at a law firm. They just know everyone's going to work remotely. How do I do that, right? And so I think some of the consideration I'm going to throw in, because I think I've already beaten to death think about what your needs are and apply. Everyone gets that. So I think that the interesting consideration here is maybe you should be using more of the cloud than what you're planning, just to build some resilience into the business operation. The COVID pandemic has obviously painted a picture for people where they went, holy crap, we never thought this could happen. Yeah. I mean, none of us thought it, right, at all. Like, you're all going to work from home forever and never leave your house. That kind of thing. What? And that's not going to happen. Yeah, it did. And so the cloud is what's going to help you with that. Sure, there are ways to get remote access to your work. And I get it. But the cloud might be a good opportunity to move to services that, software as a service, move some of the services up, and you don't have an on-prem CRM, go use Salesforce. You don't have your on-prem Exchange, go use Microsoft 365, whatever, and then also move some of the workloads up, and then even remote desktops or something along those lines. There's a lot of great the cloud vendors themselves have that, where you're having the ability to do virtual desktops as well. So there's a lot of capability there, and I think that might be the consideration I'd add into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. All right. And as next question, when you were giving your final thoughts there, we certainly touched upon this a bit. But there's a guy who's saying, we're concerned about costs. We've heard about cloud costs spiraling out of control. How do we manage that?
Oh boy. So here's the reality. First off, I don't pitch product. I never do. I don't pitch anybody's product.
Understood.
That's not impartial. But the reality is, if any of you are in that boat where you're going, everything's out of control. We don't even know what we spend. We did with the CFO once a month, and I don't even know where that VM even is. That kind of thing. You're going to need to find there's some third-party solutions that exist out today that will work across. I think all the big, maybe some other the smaller ones. Mm-hmm. And they'll consolidate that stuff for you so that you can figure out what you're using, when you're using, who's using it, all that kind of stuff. And then that way you can start to figure out how to you need visibility first. You're never going to be able to figure out how to solve the cost problem until you know how big of a problem you actually have and where the biggest. So I think that is actually the answer. The answer is you're going to have to go get a third-party product that specifically does looking at resource usage, looking at licensing, looking at tiered pricing, figuring out. Going down this path in a slightly different variant. Those people that are thinking of going to the cloud, which cloud do you pick? I know there's solutions that are out there that even will take your current, let's say it's a physical box for the sake of argument, or it's an on-prem VM, and it'll look at the requirements there, and it'll go and kind of calculate against certain cloud providers and go, this one's going to give you the best bang for the buck. So that kind of stuff does exist. You're going to have to go look for it. Because again, I don't promote product, but that is the answer. I know you want the answer like, just go into the such and such console in AWS, and it isn't.
It's not quite that easy. Not quite
third party.
Yeah. There's a reason those solutions exist. Because there's clearly a need for them for sure. Yeah. I mean, it can spiral out of control if it's left unmanaged. All right, good. Probably got time for one more quick question, and hopefully this is a fairly simple one. Security remaining a concern. This gentleman asked, how do we ensure we have the same levels of security in the cloud as with our on-premises data center?
That depends first off on thinking about if you guys have ever seen the shared responsibility model kind of took a chunk, and it's sort of like software as a service, and then platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, and application as a service, and that kind of thing. And by the way, if you want to see a really great example of how this applies to the real world, go search for an image on pizza as a service. Hopefully no one's put an inappropriate image on that term, but if you look at it, it's very funny. It covers everything from making it yourself at home to delivery and shows you how it's just like the shared responsibility model. But anyways, I think it depends on where that shared responsibility model is divided. And I mentioned this a little earlier. If you're using something where other people, cloud techs, I'll call them for the sake of argument, people that work for the cloud provider have access to your VM somehow or the underlying infrastructure, that could present a problem. So if that's the first thing. Beyond that, then we're talking about, as I'm kind of walking up the stack, then we're talking about things like at a network layer and at an operating system level and the applications and the data itself and permissions. And now we're sort of getting into like it's just another environment. And so you really, I think it's more so especially the levels that the cloud providers are working at is probably more about protecting the environment as a whole than they are trying to protect it's not like let me install an agent inside your VM that we're going to manage that kind of thing. And they do, some do, but I mean, they're working with that level. So I think partially it goes back to a little bit of the answer around skill set of understand what the capabilities are of the cloud provider you have from a security standpoint. Definitely have to be thinking about the issue of, cybersecurity. Just today, there's a new Microsoft patch for DNS. Somebody actually figure out how to get elevated access to an Active Directory domain controller with a malformed request, and it's very cool. And I don't recommend you try it. Or maybe you can. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just that simple. So we're certainly thinking at that level. But at the same time, eventually, it's going to come down to you all have to figure out if you're hosting workloads and they run on operating systems or they run in containers or wherever they're running inside of, that those have to be secure too. That's probably still going to be on you, is my guess. So it's not a great answer, but it's an answer.
That's a complex equation for sure. You just got to make sure you extend your own best practices. So, all right. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for your input and your explanations, Nick. As always, it's been great. And I'd like to give a big thanks to NetApp, Zerto, and VMware Cloud Health for their sponsorship. Thank you all for listening in today. We hope you enjoyed this event. And now back to you, Tracy.
Oh, thank you so much. Blake and Nick, that was a great way to end the summit today. It was a really good presentation and conversation. So, and thank you for taking time out of your day and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. And I would like to thank all of our moderators and speakers who shared their time and expertise with us and made this a really terrific event. Also, I'd like to thank the audience for participating in today's summit, and a special thank you goes out to our sponsors who made today's event possible, Cloud Health by VMware, Zerto, and NetApp. One last thing before we close out the event. When you exit, a short survey will pop up. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's summit, and we encourage you to provide us with your comments and suggestions. And beyond that, I just want to thank everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and this concludes our webcast.